We get to know people starting in early childhood. At first, these are older people who take care of us and show an interest in our development. Yet soon, peers become an even wider group of people that we meet. Some of them are just ordinary playmates, whereas the others become lifelong friends, being with us during important moments and helping us solve the problems that we need to face. At times, though, peers do not want to be our friends. They are unkind, they make fun of us, they humiliate and reject us. It happens that they beat or even blackmail us. We may become the victims of bullying under such circumstances. What for some is only good fun and a joke, for others it may be distressing and harmful. That is how peer violence looks, meaning the situation when a young person experiences nuisance or injustice from people of a similar age. That can also be physical or mental abuse, which may also be deployed by means of new technologies, the internet or mobile phones, and shall be then described as cyberbullying. Whatever the form of aggression is, it is hard to predict in advance what the consequences of it will be, both for the victims and the aggressors, as well as for the witnesses. We would like you to meet Adam, whose story you will follow throughout the whole course. It will help you to understand what bullying is and how you can deal with it. Adam is 15. He is a tall, slim, and good-looking boy. He is rather polite and shy. He likes listening to music and skateboarding. He seems to be an ordinary teenager, and you would probably not pay any attention to him if you passed him in the street. So, you would not know that his shirt's long sleeves hide cuts on his wrists from when he tried to kill himself for the first time. The second time he tried to hang himself, unsuccessfully again. It was at that moment when Adam noted, all these people need to be right because you really have to be an idiot not to be able to even kill yourself. Until recently, Adam lived with his parents and his 10 years younger sister. At the moment, he spends most of the time in a psychiatric hospital. This is Adam, a 15-year-old boy who has been the victim of bullying and cyberbullying for 2 years. It is extremely significant in Adam's story that his parents only learnt about his problems when they found him in the bathroom with his wrists slashed. How could they have not noticed anything earlier? For many parents, it is a black eye or a bleeding nose that seems to be the symbol of violence, whereas the first complaints or moaning are treated as making a fuss and being bored with school. Sometimes, it is easy to explain everything this way, as it shifts the necessity of tackling the problem away from the parents. Since a large part of our lives takes place in cyberspace, the victim of peer violence cannot feel safe anywhere. Even home, which was considered a haven and a hideaway before, does not guarantee peace and the possibility of distancing yourself from the offenders. The tension mounts, and finally, the child cannot stand it anymore. In this course, we would like to introduce you to the topic of peer violence, both in the real world and in cyberspace. The training will concern the recognition and dealing with the bullying and cyberbullying problem. It will also help you to decide when the right moment to seek for help of a specialist is. We will also try to dispel some myths associated with this issue. We are strongly convinced that after finishing this course, you will know how to recognize the symptoms of bullying in your child, how to intervene effectively, and how to communicate both with the offender and his victim. All the course materials have been prepared specifically for the parents and caretakers of school children. All the knowledge will be presented in plain and easily comprehensible language. You may expect the lectures in the form of films, accompanied with many examples and explanations, as well as exercises, quizzes, and printable materials which are aimed to help you in everyday work with the child. The author, responsible for the content of the course, is a psychotherapist with many years of experience gained from working with children. We do guarantee that all of the information you will get will be based on the newest psychological and psychotherapeutic knowledge. We invite you to start the workshops on dealing with bullying and cyberbullying. Aggression, violence, harassment. Don't you have the impression that these words appear on the news in the context of school, students, and children too often? Increasing physical and mental abuse among young people raises huge concerns and makes us feel helpless. Yet, should every sign of aggression be considered bullying? It turns out that no, and that it is worth to realize what the difference is. Bullying. Bullying is a form of violence. There is no doubt about it. It is aimed at hurting the other person by arousing fear, causing distress, humiliating, or causing physical pain. Bullying is never a random incident. On the contrary, it is fully intentional, done repeatedly, and aimed at causing the anguish of the other person. The suffering is even greater because of the fact that the incidents are usually observed by a group of spectators, and the victim does not have any chance to defend him or herself. What is the difference between ordinary, everyday misunderstandings and bullying then? First and foremost, it is the duration. Bullying is long-lasting, and the advantage the offender has over his or her victim, strength, age, etc. Let's imagine a situation of a school fight between two 10-year-old boys who start with yelling, move on to tussling, and are eventually separated by a teacher. It is a situation which may look the same when it comes to both bullying and an ordinary conflict from the outside. So what is the difference? In case of a common misunderstanding, when the excitement connected with the fight decreases, both the boys will be able to make a decision what happens next with their friendship. They can be good friends again the very next day. They can limit their contact or even stop being friends. When it comes to bullying, it needs to be understood that this was just one of many incidents which took place and surely will not be the last. If we had a closer look at the causes of that conflict, we would probably find out that one of these boys was made fun of and being provoked for a longer period of time. He could have been forced to give away his lunch or money, or might have been forced to go into the restroom by his schoolmates and had his head put into the toilet. Perhaps he was poked, humiliated, or hit in places where no sign of violence are visible a number of times. In such a case, separating the students by a teacher will only be a short intervention, not leading to any real results. What will the next few weeks bring? The boy will go back to school where he will have to face all his nightmares again. He will be insulted, humiliated, and beaten again. What is bullying then, and what kind of behavior does it include? Direct physical bullying is pushing, spitting, hitting, kicking, taking things, and being forced to do unwanted, humiliating activities. Emotional, verbal bullying is humiliating, making fun of somebody, threatening and provoking. Indirect, concealed, relational bullying is backbiting, gossiping, and persuading others to isolate the victim. Basically, bullying is a sort of behavior which is aimed at hurting the other person, making him or her feel threatened and hounded. It may even result in rejections by his or her peers. 3 conditions must be met here. Long-lasting and repeatable behavior as a one-time quarrel or conflict does not mean bullying. Strength advantage, purely physical, caused by the age difference, the number of the aggressors, or their status in a group. Motivation to harm, as the aim of the offender must be hurting the victim and the actions that he or she takes cannot be incidental. Ordinary arguments, single acts of aggression, or cases of rejecting the other person, which happen in every social group, should not be considered bullying. Yet, we should remember that these acts always require intervention as well. Cyberbullying. According to various statistics, between 20 and 50% of young people suffer from cyberbullying. It is indeed a serious problem which may result in extremely serious consequences. Suicide, willingly publicized by the media, is just one of many horrendous repercussions of cyberbullying. Similarly to other forms of violence, one using the newest technologies is also aimed at causing emotional harm of another person. It is fostered by the availability of the internet and the fact that teenagers' lives are currently centered on the screens of their mobile phones. There are numerous means of communication on the internet, which leads to the fact that cyberbullying may be used in direct contact by harassing, threatening, and blackmailing, as well as by making embarrassing films or photos publicly available. What is really important, children often do not recognize these forms of behavior as violence and rather consider them as good fun. Virtual reality makes mental abuse easy to employ, as the offender often remains anonymous and his or her actions, made public on the internet, provides him or her a wide audience. It is a form of aggression that does not take much effort, yet removing its results is extremely hard. You should remember that it is hard to escape from the harm done in the virtual world, as it affects the victim in school, at home, or even when on holidays away from his or her hometown, regardless of the time of day or night. How big are the differences between bullying and cyberbullying? Both these forms of behavior have a lot in common. The main difference is in the tool, which is a mobile phone or a laptop with an internet connection in the case of cyberbullying. Virtual violence causes tremendous damage that is difficult to repair, mainly because of the fact that it has many witnesses, especially ones that know the victim. Content that goes viral will hurt the harassed person each time he or she sees it or somebody reminds him or her of it. On the contrary, it is harder for the offender to see the harm he or she has caused. Yet, without feelings of guilt, he or she will have no reason to stop acting in this manner, unless the issue of legal consequences arises or there is punishment from parents or teachers. Both the violence implemented in cyberspace, as well as in real life, are such complicated tasks that there is no one easy way to eliminate them. It is surely important to build the trust between children and their parents and teachers to enable them to catch the signals the harassment causes. Prevention programs, as well as legal regulations, should protect the children that are the most vulnerable, whereas the people who have the tendency to deploy violence should get some help from the school counselor and a psychologist to deal with the anger and tension. It is extremely important to educate the children who are the witnesses of the harassment as well, as the reaction of the group of observers has great influence on the intensification or weakening of the offender's behavior. A little bit of history. How did the fight with bullying start? The phenomenon of bullying has gained further importance in the 21st century, yet it is dated back to the 1970s of when it was first described by Peter Paul Heinemann. It was then when the problem started to be extensively researched, which eventually led to the signature of the Declaration Against Bullying in Children and Youth in Switzerland in 2007. The document has emphasized the role and the responsibilities of the adults with the words, "Every child and youth, among other rights, has the right to be respected and safe, which is the moral responsibility of adults." Meanwhile, in 1999, an event showed the catastrophic consequences of bullying took place. Two students in a high school in Columbine, Colorado, after being bullied by their peers for a long time, shot a teacher and several students and then committed suicide. Soon after that incident, at the beginning of the 21st century, a Japanese boy got recorded with a mobile phone during an embarrassing situation in a school locker room. The video instantly went viral, and as a result, the boy killed himself. At the same time, another girl got her photos altered into some pornographic content on her email. Shortly afterwards, she found them published on the internet and hung up outside of her school. All these materials were popular online, and their victims suffered great consequences. Yet it should be noted that these situations took place at a time when the internet was rather less widespread than it is now. Do you remember Adam, the boy that was introduced at the beginning of our course? He has suffered both bullying and cyberbullying, as these two forms are inseparable today. From his example, you will learn how the aggressive behavior of a group towards the victim starts and develops. You will see that physical bullying is only the tip of the iceberg, yet not the most hurtful. Let us introduce a situation when Adam was invited to a friend's party as an example. Several classmates and the host herself were pretending to be friendly towards Adam, but when the main offender started to make fun of him, the rest of the group joined in eagerly. Recording Adam as he welled up with tears leaving the party was the climax of the situation. The video went viral with a caption, "Real man wins a lady." In this case, we had a really devastating mix of behavior: cyberbullying, verbal abuse, and relational bullying. Do you think it was less painful for this young man than pulling his jacket? Or perhaps more? It was only one of the whole range of incidents that almost led to the greatest tragedy and devastated his relationship with his peers, his self-esteem, as well as the joy and desire to live. You already know that bullying is a form of aggression. But what exactly is aggression? After all, you understand this word well, and you're able to define violent behavior if you happen to see it, aren't you? Let's imagine the following situation. A group of girls is getting on a school bus. Another one didn't make it on time, and she's running towards the bus. She is aware that the driver doesn't see her, so she's shouting to her friends to stop the bus. The girls get onto the bus as if nothing had happened. The bus leaves, and the latecomer stays at the bus stop. Would you be able to distinguish this behavior as aggressive on the basis of this description? According to a definition, aggression is a deliberate action aimed at hurting somebody or causing pain, physical or mental. Without being aware of the background of this story, it's hard to identify if that is the case in this situation. If the girls were involved in a conversation and didn't notice their friend, the situation should obviously be described as accidental. If they had seen her and didn't attempt to stop the bus, yet had socialized with her ordinarily before, it could have just been a stupid joke. However, if the girl who missed the bus had already come across verbal or physical aggression, the conversations in her presence had been quieted, and she had been rejected by her peers, then the history with the bus may be further proof that she has become the victim of harassment. It's hard to be sure if that was a coincidence, a manifestation of violence, or long-lasting harassment on the basis of a single incident. That's why attention from teachers and counselors, along with refraining from quick, impulsive assessments of the situation, is so important. These types of ambiguous incidents happen on an everyday basis. Listen carefully to two more examples and try to describe when they are aggressive and when they are not. Try to distinguish when they are examples of long-lasting harassment as well. Two boys are walking down the corridor. There's a friend of theirs standing by the lockers. One of the boys walking pushes the other so that he bumps into the standing boy, who painfully hits the locker door with his head. Some students are leaving a classroom after the lesson has finished. One of them trips over a friend's leg, falls down, and twists his ankle. Can you invent a possible scenario for each of these scenes? If so, you will undoubtedly learn that the same incident may mean something completely different depending on the relationship that the boys have. You already know that aggression is just not as easy to identify as it may seem at first glance. Explore different types of violent behavior then. If you want to be able to deal with harassment, you need to know what kind of forms it takes. Classification 1. Regarding the cause of aggression. Reactive aggression is a situation when the offender reacts to a threat or rejection from other people. A schoolyard example can be a boy who beats a weaker friend because he didn't let him copy his notes. Whereas proactive aggression is aimed at seeking an advantage or causing suffering of the other person, as described in the situation in which a group of children take a friend's book and throw it throughout the corridor. Classification 2. Regarding if the offender has direct contact with the victim, then it is direct aggression, beating, calling names face-to-face, spitting. Or if he or she doesn't, then it's indirect aggression, backbiting, spreading gossip, damaging the victim's belongings. Classification 3, regarding the offender's objective. When it comes to instrumental aggression, the offender wants to achieve a specific goal, for instance, to acquire some of the victim's belongings. Whereas affective aggression means actions of an impulsive, emotional nature, without a predetermined goal. Classification 4, regarding the actions taken. It comprises of different types of aggression: physical, kicking, yanking, pushing somebody; verbal, insulting, threatening, offending; and nonverbal, tone of voice, making faces, offensive gestures. It might seem that physical bullying is the most harmful and the most dangerous of these three. Yet it is not true, as all these forms are equally dangerous. Why is it so? Bruises disappear and scratches heal much faster than emotional wounds. Do you still remember a situation when a classmate pushed you and you bumped your head? Probably not, right? Yet we are totally positive that you can recall a situation from your childhood when you were made fun of, insulted, or offended. The same happens with every single child. Verbal bullying undermines his or her self-esteem, generates fear and the feeling of embarrassment, which sticks to the youngster for a long time. Relational bullying, of which you have learnt about briefly on our previous lesson, is the most harmful for the youth's self-esteem. Being excluded from a group of peers by actual isolation, spreading gossip, or not inviting him or her to parties is definitely a situation hard to bear for a young person, especially at school age when relations with peers are so important for the development of his or her identity. Although verbal and relational violence occurs twice as often as physical bullying, parents and teachers often don't manage to notice it. It results in great damage to the victim, as long-lasting stress connected with this type of bullying causes problems in subsequent years. What are its effects and how to deal with them? You will learn that within the next lessons. The classification that has just been mentioned shows how many tools the offenders have to overwhelm the victim. It's worth to know that the interference of adults very often suppresses just one action, for instance, calling names or physical assault, while the others are ignored. You will now learn an exceptional form of violence, which is passive aggression. Its definition already says a lot. It's deliberately disguised expression of anger. We're sure you've met some people who seem to behave properly at first glance, yet you were sure that they want to upset you. If you reacted nervously, they made their point. It is the most satisfying for people using passive aggression when their victim loses his or her temper. Passive aggression causes lots of problems for teachers and parents, as it's quite easy for their protégés to defend him or herself. "I haven't done anything. She just started yelling at me," is just one example so familiar to many parents having more than one child. Children have mastered using this mechanism, and adults very often just pass over it lightly, leaving the children to themselves as nobody gets hurt, right? What is more, very often it's the victim, when he or she finally loses his or her temper, that gets punished. It was him or her that committed real violence eventually. Do you remember the beginning of the lesson when we talked about the importance of recognizing aggressive behavior? This is a perfect example of a situation when it will be useful. We will now present some scenes where passive-aggressive behavior plays a key role. "It's only a joke. Let it go." Sarcasm, irony, light taunting that ends with a statement that it was only a joke are typical tools of passive aggression. It's just expressing hostility in a way that is socially accepted. When the offended person protests, he or she will hear a contemptuous statement like, "You just don't have a sense of humor." The offender is usually an expert on keeping calm and expressing fake amazement, while the victim tired of the attacks, finally shows anger. In reality, it is a moment of triumph for the aggressor, as it lets him or her express his or her contempt, or even show him or her as a victim themselves. Nothing happened. Denying that a conflict exists is a common tactic used by children quite often. It is regularly accompanied with an open aggression expressed in a certain way, especially towards the victim. Let's imagine a situation when a teacher separates fighting children. One of them confidently holds out his hand to reconcile with the other student. If the second child responds that nothing happened, yet his or her voice tone and posture says something different, you can be sure that the conflict hasn't finished yet and will be continued on the way back home, for example. That kind of behavior additionally raises fear in the victim, who is still expecting the worst from that moment on. I thought you knew about it. Concealing some information which might be important or useful for the victim is another unpleasant form of the passive aggression use. By pretending a lack of knowledge, the oppressor enjoys the problem that he or she has caused and the annoyance of the victim, pretending to be innocent at the same time. A perfect example here could be a situation that takes place on a sport camp. The coach calls all the players together and announces that they are leaving for a trip half an hour earlier than previously planned. He asks them to inform all the children who didn't come to the assembly also. Most of the group members don't like one boy, so nobody informs him about the change, and when he's not ready on time, he is publicly reprimanded. The rest of the group enjoys the whole situation, and their only explanation addressed to him is, "We thought you knew." You're doing fine for a person who, theoretically, it's a compliment, yet in fact, it's an insult. If you ever happen to hear, "You're a great dancer," for such an overweight person, or "The cake's really good," taking into account that your mother never taught you how to bake, you will surely recognize this type of passive aggression. There are many more passive-aggressive forms of behavior. These can be expressed by avoiding basic social relations, by not noticing somebody on the street, for instance, ignoring text messages, not answering questions, and many more examples which theoretically don't seem to be aggressive. These forms of behavior don't only involve the offender and the victim. It is very often the case that the passive-aggressive people encourage the others to join these actions from the very beginning, provoking group mental abuse this way. Do you still remember our friend Adam? He has suffered from a lot of harassment, so from his example, it will be easy to see how the bullying starts and what form it can take over time. It all started with reactive aggression in Adam's case. Peter, a senior friend who was an informal leader of his group, thought that Adam would be useful for their sport team. He told Adam assertively that he must join the team. However, Adam refused. This form of pastime was not at all attractive to him. Peter approached him then and publicly, in the presence of a large group of friends, spat on his shoes. It got even worse later on as it triggered the proactive aggression. Adam became the main scapegoat of Peter's assaults, who spat on him, kicked him, took his belongings, and told tall tales about him. The whole group soon joined Peter in his attacks on Adam, insulting him and turning their backs each time he passed by. Trying to talk with the friends didn't help, as they cut him off and treated Adam as if he didn't exist. The more the impunity of the aggressors increased, the more often Adam was deprived of his money and clothes. The offenders never called their attacks by their name, claiming constantly that these were just jokes, pranks, or tussles. The conflict that stemmed from Peter's wounded pride eventually escalated into bullying by the whole team, class, and then school which Adam attended. Children who are allowed to use mobile phones, tablets, and laptops with an internet connection very quickly learn how to use them efficiently. It may even seem that they gradually become inseparable from their mobiles. It's quite natural for them to use virtual tools, and they understand the principles of the web far better than most adults. As long as they use the internet for useful purposes like searching for information, learning, and playing for most of the time, it happens that the darker side of a child's nature is laid bare in the virtual world. When it comes to harassing their peers, young people take advantage of absolutely everything that the internet can offer them. One shot is enough. UNICEF's perfectly implemented social campaign even says cyberbullying represents one of the main causes of depression and suicide among kids at school. If you have a smartphone, use it wisely. Don't kill anyone's self-esteem. In a moment, you will learn some basic methods which young aggressors use on the internet. Perhaps, thanks to them, you will be able to take a closer look at your child's virtual behavior and notice some alarming schemes. Cyberstalking. The situation when a child follows somebody on the internet for a longer period of time, disrupts his or her life, and communicates with him or her in a way that the person is afraid of his or her peace and safety, is very often trivialized by parents. Stalking in real life requires a lot of effort and involvement from the oppressor. However, stalking on the internet, due to its commonness and relative anonymity, has become a favorite medium of stalkers. This type of aggression very often occurs between people who know each other, knew each other in the past, or were even in close relations. Flame war. Flaming is an aggressive exchange of views between several people, usually conducted publicly in chat rooms or within discussion groups. The phenomenon of flaming is just unpleasant, yet rather common. It may have more serious consequences when it transforms into bullying. There's no place in it to have a proper discussion, as the offenders don't refer to what the victim writes, concentrating strictly on causing harm. In a short period of time, a casual conversation about sport teams, favorite car brands, or computer games evolves into a series of insults and attacks. Harassment. Harassment is based on sending aggressive, disgracing, insulting, often vulgar messages to the victim by electronic means of communication regularly. A mobile phone, instant messenger, or chat system in an online game can be used here as well. Only two people are involved in the situation, the oppressor and the victim, but it happens sometimes that the aggression escalates quickly and evolves into sending serious threats to the victim. Impersonation, identity theft. One of the main motives of an identity thief is to impersonate his or her victim in cyberspace. Using weak passwords for the email or instant messenger often makes it easier for the aggressor to act. And even though it doesn't explain the aggressor's motives, it's good to be aware of the fact that an identity thief can cause a lot of problems for his or her victim by sending discreditable messages to other students and teachers. Outing. A great number of places which store our data nowadays favors the aggressors, whose favorite method of working is outing. Stolen from the victim's computer or records of phone conversations, films or photos can instantly be made publicly available or get to people who definitely shouldn't have access to them. It also happens that before the materials go viral, the aggressor blackmails the owner, demanding to fulfill his or her own expectations, such as exposing the victim in front of an internet camera or paying a kind of ransom. Happy slapping. It's just another way to acquire discrediting materials, even more vicious than the previous ones. Its objective is to provoke and attack the victim to document the attack itself and the victim's reaction to the photos and films. Then everything is held, just like in other examples of cyberbullying. The material goes viral or the victim is blackmailed with the threat of their publishing. Denigration. This form of aggressive behavior is based on publishing fake information or materials about some people. These can be ordinary rumors about the victim's participation in some embarrassing events, yet they are often altered films or photos suggesting that the victim is performing sexual acts. Remember, photoshopping of other people's photos is very often not as innocent as it may seem. Exclusion. Removing somebody deliberately from a list of contacts, discussion group, or a chat led by a group of friends results in excluding the victim from a group of peers. It's often one of the forms of relational bullying of which you learnt on our previous lesson, and it's not less harmful due to the fact that it takes place in a virtual world. Technical aggression. This form of assault requires a little bit more technical knowledge. However, don't let it calm you down. These days, children know more about the electronic devices than it may seem. Technical aggression is the attack on the computer used by the victim, his or her computer software, or a web page. It involves sending computer viruses or hacking. Activities such as mail bombing, which is sending a vast number of messages on an email account to disrupt its functioning, or an attempt to hack the victim's computer by sending him or her the so-called Trojan mass mailer, can also take place. School has been a hostile place for Adam for a very long time. However, now he has also started to experience attacks in his own house. It started in such an innocent way, from a comment written by Adam under a school trip photo. "It will be nicer next time." Adam commented, recalling that cold, rainy day. After a short moment, the replies to his comment started to appear. "It will indeed be nicer when you're not there. It's enough when you stop commenting." At first, these didn't contain any swearing or insults. However, that wasn't the end. Other commentators soon joined in. The aggression was rising very fast, and the comments that became more and more abusive were liked by a large group of Adam's friends. It was then when he felt that he couldn't really feel safe anywhere, and the assault in a virtual world hurts just as much as a punch in the ribs. To be able to deal with bullying, you need to understand it first. What lies at the roots of this phenomenon? Why do some children and teenagers change into aggressors without any visible reason? Without finding the answers to these questions, you won't be able to undertake effective actions, no matter whether you are trying to protect your child from bullying or whether you would already have to intervene. When you are wondering what the answers for the questions asked should be, doesn't the phrase, "In my time, that was absolutely inconceivable," come to your mind? Right, in my time. Rapid social changes pace, growing expectations towards children, material status differences increase, unemployment, development of technology. All these factors influence the exacerbation of the peer violence phenomenon and makes it more difficult for us, parents, to provide such protection for our children as we would wish. You will now become familiar with the four main spheres that influence the occurrence of aggressive behavior among children and teenagers. Personality sphere. That means inborn features such as sensitivity and temper, as well as the features of character shaped by the environment and the natural development of the child, including disorders and diseases. Home environment sphere. Extremely important for the development and the process of bringing up the young person. Home is the place where we observe parents' behavior, learning from the earliest age what the interpersonal relations are, what is and what isn't acceptable, and how to deal with some difficult situations. It is also our safety zone, meaning a place where we should feel well, safe, and confident. If there are some disorders within this sphere, they will be visible in all other aspects of life as well. School environment sphere, which is the first place in each person's life that treats organizational, system, and pedagogical tasks seriously. We function in particular systems throughout our whole lives, which establish some frames for us. For us adults, it is work, home, neighbors, and friends. At work, we need to adjust to a proper dress code. We need to speak to our management in a certain way. That is what a structured environment means. School and home and its vicinity are this kind of neighborhood for our children, and because of that, it is important to be aware of what is accepted and what makes their parents and caretakers protest. Other factors sphere: age, sex, sexual orientation, peer group membership. These are all conditions which may foster violence occurrence, both from the perspective of being the oppressor when a child joins a group that uses violence, such as a gang, and from the perspective of a victim as well, because other than heterosexual orientation is one of the risk factors, for instance. We shall elaborate on the personality sphere and other factors group in the following part of the course, as they have the greatest influence on who is the most liable to become a victim and the aggressor. Now we shall have a close look at the home and school environment spheres because the potential occurrence of violence depends mostly on the conditions prevailing there. The causes of bullying and cyberbullying within the home environment sphere: parents' unemployment, constant risk of losing a job, lack of parents' time for family matters, conflicts and domestic violence between the parents or between the parents and the children, parents' addictions, unpleasant atmosphere at home, lack of empathy of the members of the family to each other, adopting a dictatorial attitude by the parents, which means giving orders without really listening to the needs and difficulties of the child, lack of parenting skills, aggression towards children, excessive submissiveness, and inconsequence in upbringing, denying the taking of responsibility of the child's behavior, for example by shifting the responsibility on other factors. The child is obedient, she was only tired. Accepting violent behavior by the parents. The causes of bullying and cyberbullying within school environment sphere: trivializing minor misbehaviors such as playing truant or being late for school, impunity when it comes to stealing, extortion, or beating, the lack of mutual respect between students, parents, and teachers, less clear rules of conduct and their assessment confusing criteria, no system of revealing the incorrectness within school functioning, lack of sincere contact and dialogue between students, teachers, and parents, imperfect teachers' teamwork, no possibility to relax and rest for the students and teachers, or not enough time devoted to it. The excess of didactical functions at the expense of pedagogic functions of school. Limiting the number of extracurricular activities. The sense of small value of the role played among the teachers. Arrogance and diminishing the problem by authorities not related to school. Children who use violence at school have a feeling of control and power because of that, and thanks to their behaviors they feel more popular, especially when these acts are acknowledged by their peers and ignored by adults. Research conducted on children that commit harassment shows that the most frequent reason of using violence is the identification with a specific subgroup. For example, popular at school groups of trendy peers, and the improvement of their social status by acting from the perspective of strength. These kinds of behaviors often happen among children with low self-esteem, which is a feature that is hard to notice at first glance. The child, after all, may be trendy, open, and expressive. The thing that should attract the attention of adults is the fact that the child defines him or herself only by external attributes such as money, clothes, gadgets, or by domination over others. The research clearly indicates that people who undertake bullying and cyberbullying are made popular by arousing fear by which they subjugate the others, yet are not liked by others. How does it all start? That is the mechanisms of the phenomenon. Both bullying and cyberbullying begin with finding a scapegoat, at which single aggressive acts of behavior, mainly verbal violence, calling names, mocking, are targeted. If the victim starts to manifest some negative emotions and the inability to oppose the assault, and his or her peer group takes an interest in what is happening and accepts or even intensifies aggressive behavior, the offender starts to feel like an actor on stage. The bigger the interest from the witnesses, the greater the offender's desire to repeat violent behavior is. If there is nobody that stands up for the victim, then the violence evolves. Behaviors aimed at humiliating the other person, unpleasant gossiping, physical and internet aggression start to emerge. As the time passes by, the person who is the victim of mobbing isolates him or herself from their peers, and his or her impression of being a worse person grows. To avoid violent happenings, he or she may create situations that allow him or her to avoid contact with the oppressor. A child may start to simulate being ill or just play truant. Looking for help within other groups takes place as well. It's good when he or she finds it in a sport club or a church, yet he or she may end up in a dysfunctional environment such as a criminal group, a gang, or a sect. Vicious cycle of peer violence. At the beginning, the person who has become the scapegoat does not entirely realize it. He or she very often tries to act rationally in order to ease the conflict, and after noticing that this doesn't work, he or she may just withdraw. The defense is very often passive, and its objective is to submit to the aggressors, do what they tell him or her to do, bring or get them all the things they want. This state of subordination is quite understandable, as the oppressor and the victim are totally distinct when it comes to physical conditions or popularity in their environment. Unfortunately, the more the child is subordinated, the greater the scale of physical violence that is put on him is. At this stage, it can only be an observant pedagogue or parent that will notice something wrong is going on. At home and at school, everything seems to look just normal. The person that provokes the cycle of violence, and all examples of bullying have their leader, starts to undermine the value of the victim by mocking his or her knowledge, skills, appearance, and behaviors. He or she starts to spread gossip and tends to isolate the harmed child, who starts to feel alienated, humiliated, and with a lower self-esteem. What is more, constant tension results in stress reactions, sleeping, concentration and memory disorders, anxiety disorders, sadness, and anger. The second stage consists of strengthening of aggressive behaviors and negative opinions on the victim. Bullying and diminishing the position in a group starts. Nobody wants to talk to the harassed person. The tasks that are assigned to him or her are the least relevant or humiliating. Constant, unjustified grievances and accusations, as well as the feeling of total helplessness, can cause aggressive reaction of the victim, which worsens the situation even more. Health consequences at this stage are various psychosomatic disorders, stomach aches and headaches, rashes, decreased immunity. That is the phase when a child undertakes his or her first attempts to run away from that wrongful situation. Younger children simulate illnesses to stay at home. The older ones often skip classes. An attentive teacher may at this stage catch the first symptoms of bullying, such as the fact that a student sits alone during a lesson, does not participate in the peers' games. Sometimes a young person tries to compensate the situation by trying to show his or her knowledge and getting closer to the teacher, which only makes his peers even more aggressive. The victim of violence, when asked directly about his or her situation, does not usually admit it. At the same time, the offenders do not see the problem at all. It's already at that stage when the victim is considered to be leprous. His or her image is clearly negative in the conscience of the group, and it is extremely hard to persuade the other children to make any sincere contact with him or her. Even the children of neutral attitude or objecting this kind of behavior are afraid to do anything, not to point the aggressor's attention at them, particularly because the main oppressors very often involve students who would never be willing to behave aggressively themselves. In the third phase, where the physical harassment is more advanced, the situation gets dramatically intensified. The young person cannot tackle his everyday duties, and his physical and mental condition gets so bad that he or she needs medical and psychological help. He or she may definitely refuse to go to school or demand to change it hysterically. This situation is a potential foretaste of a great tragedy. At that stage, children frequently run away from home, join different subcultures or sects where they find acceptance, and eventually they may even make an attempt to commit suicide. The story of Adam illustrates the whole bullying and cyberbullying cycle. At the very beginning, when Adam refused to meet the demands of his friend, he didn't know that it would be the beginning of a real nightmare. After coming back home, he took up what he had planned earlier, cleaning his bike, not thinking much about the whole situation. Meanwhile, his friend started to think about the revenge. He considered Adam's refusal as an insult and decided he needs to show the whole world what happens when somebody says no to him. When Adam got back to school the next day, a friend passing by on the corridor hit him with an arm and then started to yell at him to mind where he's walking. Disoriented, Adam backed off trying to ease the situation. Yet, the very next day, when he was waiting in front of a classroom with a group of friends, some of them started to make fun of him and mock him. Adam put on a brave face, pretending to be laughing himself at the jokes. The following days were even worse. Being attacked more and more, Adam started to do the homework for a group of boys, give them his breakfast and even his own clothes if somebody liked them. He hoped that the conflict will come to an end and his friends will leave him alone. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. No one of the adults noticed the problem, even experienced teachers, especially that the boys who troubled Adam were of good homes and popular. Adam's parents didn't notice an initially minor change in the boy's behavior as well. The boy was harassed more and more intensively. Some rumors started at school that he is a homosexual, and there were pink flowers with vulgar insults stuck to his school locker. One day, when he was taking a shower after physical education classes, all his clothes were taken away, along with his underwear and towel, with a dress left instead. On the internet, there was a photo doctored showing him lying with another man, and Adam's mailbox was bombarded with some insulting messages. Adam withdrew from the social life of the class for good. He started to have sleeping disorders, regularly waking up in the middle of the night dripping with sweat, and he couldn't fall asleep, being stressed about the next day at school. When the tension was so intense that the boy couldn't possibly deal with it on his own, he reacted with tantrums, enabling his oppressors to make some more offensive comments. He started to suffer from constant stomach aches and headaches. He vomited every morning. He started to skip classes and stopped learning. His parents, busy working, still didn't notice the problem. Adam left his house every day, yet rarely got to school. The day when a group of friends attacked Adam in a school cloakroom was a real turning point. They started to call him names, spat on him, finally forced him to simulate a sexual act, and eventually beat him. It was that moment when Adam clammed up. A short time afterwards, he had a first suicide attempt. You already know the different kinds of violence, and you are aware of how the harassment process starts and develops. Let's consider, are there any features that are particularly characteristic for the victim? Is it possible to protect our child from becoming a victim of bullying if we know these features? Behaviors of a violent nature can be directed to both a shy and introverted person, as well as a popular and extroverted one, either a boy or a girl. Bullying is a phenomenon that can be seen at any stage of education and within every social group. Trendy, self-confident, and outgoing children can also become potential victims of peer violence. Yet, very often, we can't imagine that such a tragedy can happen to an open and cheerful boy from the neighborhood. That's a big mistake. First of all, you need to remember that people who suffer from bullying and cyberbullying experience such emotions as embarrassment, anxiety, sadness, humiliation, or helplessness. The longer the violent behavior lasts, the more intensive these emotions become. The consequences continue even after the harassment has finished and can influence the entire personality of the victims. In the future, these will be people with low self-esteem and a sense of guilt for all those unfortunate situations that happened to them. The vast majority of children that suffered from bullying will have problems in building relationships. Why do we mention that? Because it causes some great dysfunctions both when they experience violence as well as in the adolescence period or adult life. They will never be willing to talk about their problems. They will be ashamed of all the incidents and the fear of what the friends' and parents' reaction would be, and their huge feeling of helplessness will result in the situation that they don't seek for help, as, according to them, that won't change much. At most, it will only make it worse. Because of the threats that this phenomenon is associated with, there is a whole range of scientists involved in researching it. Thanks to them, we are able to determine individual features that are responsible for the child to be especially prone to peers' aggression. You need to remember, though, that because of the fact that bullying is long-lasting, it's sometimes hard to specify to what extent are these features a cause and to what extent are they the consequence of using violence. Let us remind you, what the offenders mostly want is the position within a group of peers. For that reason, violent behavior takes place in the presence of witnesses, and the choice of the victims is aimed at minimalizing the risk of failure, both by opposing the violence by the person being attacked, him or herself, or by other students, parents, or teachers. We will provide you with a characteristic of two boys in a moment. Try to make the diagnosis yourself and define which one may become a victim and which one probably not. Peter is rather shy. He has just one friend in class. He doesn't talk much, but generally is a good student. Unfortunately, he is of poor health, and for that reason, he has missed classes frequently recently, which influenced his marks. His home situation doesn't look well either. He is being brought up by a single mother who is working all day long to make a living, so she hardly ever sees her son. Peter's mom is a shy and rather quiet person as well. They both don't like arguing. In conflict situations, they rather tend to ease and calm it down. Brent is, on the contrary, a very energetic boy. He's got lots of mates, yet he hasn't met a real friend yet. He's talkative. His biting comments mock some of his classmates very often. In a conflict situation, he doesn't seek arguing, yet he gets involved in a discussion eagerly. He has joined his class recently. He wears unusual clothes, different from the rest of the students. Brent's home situation is stable. Both parents work, trying hard to have good and close relations with their son. Brent talks with his father about what is currently going on in his life very often. What do you think? Which of the boys is more prone to suffer from violence? What distinguishes people who become the target of aggressive behavior? The research shows that when becoming a victim of bullying or violence in general, the students tend to have fewer number of friends who can defend them, more enemies who can easily support the oppressor, less support from their families and peers. However, help with everyday tasks such as doing homework, mending the bike, etc. is taken into consideration here as well. Parents that don't take enough interest in their child's school results, as the offender selects for a victim a student that doesn't attract much attention within his closest environment. These are also children of a more sensitive nature, who will be reluctant to react in a situation of violence that become the victims of violence as well. Because they are obedient, insecure, and physically weaker, they expose themselves to a much greater chance of revenge. Another important factor may be frequent school absences, especially those caused by bad physical or mental health condition. Its result is the growth of a gap between the children because the person who often misses classes becomes more anonymous. It eventually leads to a situation when the student is treated as a subject by the others. You will surely be surprised with the next risk factor of becoming a victim of bullying. It's the overprotection of parents. That's right, as not only neglected children may be in the risk group. Parents' overprotection causes that a child is not independent and sometimes even immature. The bond with the parents, which is too strong, may weaken the relations with the peers as well. Finally, when it comes to the features that predispose a child to become an easier target of violent behavior, we need to mention the sensitivity, reticence, shyness, and insecurity. As you can see, there are many risk factors. Fortunately, even when a few of them occur at once, that doesn't necessarily mean that the child will become a victim of bullying. The most basic classification of the victims of bullying is the one that categorizes the victims as passive. Passive victims are children who tend to be reflective, insecure, and introverted. When being attacked, they are helpless at defending themselves, becoming passive and full of fear, which makes them an easy target for the aggressor. In the examples of the boys that you have just learned about, Peter was that kind of person. There are also provoking victims, who are people whose behavior may trigger negative reactions in others. These children have problems with concentration and are hyperactive very often. They may be excessively communicative or just more talkative than an average member of their group. They tend to be recognizable very often by belonging to a sort of a minority group or a popular subculture, for instance. This situation happens much less frequently than with a passive attitude, yet it does take place at times. The character of these children makes other people treat them as outcasts and not like them generally. Coming back to our examples, despite the fact that the chance of Brent becoming a victim of peers' violence is much lower, he may become a provoking victim. What about our friend Adam, whose story you have been following from the very beginning? Why did he become a victim? As far as you've known him, nothing really distinguishes him, right? As you might probably think, Adam was an outsider, didn't belong to any popular group, was always standing aside. He had many mates in his class, yet not even one true friend. He was a recluse his way, the only skate in his class, wearing big headphones and loose hoodies. Although he was communicative and rather nice, he was also shy and did not appreciate the attention of the group. Despite being dexterous and fast, he was shorter and physically weaker than the group of the strongest boys in the class. That was enough to make him become a victim. The aggressor didn't really like Adam's independence, his sensitive yet assertive attitude, shaped by being outside the class spotlight. Adam didn't complain about being harassed. Therefore, nobody stood up for him. The oppressor, with the approval of the group, was becoming more and more self-confident, and all the virtues that Adam had didn't protect him from the situation that he had to face. He didn't comply with the group, and he didn't have any support. These were the reasons why his story ended up this way. Are there any warning signs that can help us to say that somebody is a victim of violence? Yes. There are many, and identifying them is an important step to prevent violence because, as you already know, most of the children who become victims of bullying or cyberbullying don't look for help. The following signs should raise your concerns. Injuries of an unknown background. Lost or damaged clothes, books, electronics, jewelry. Frequent bad moods. Real illness symptoms such as a headache or stomachache, or feeling sick, as well as identified attempts of simulating illness. Changes in eating habits, both sudden lack of appetite as well as binge eating. Children may come back home feeling hungry as their lunch was taken. Difficulty falling asleep. Nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night. Problems at school. Lower marks, a lack of interest in school, or even an unwillingness to go. Loss of friends and avoiding normal social situations. Obvious helplessness and decrease in his self-esteem. Autodestructive behavior, such as running away from home, harming him or herself, mentioning suicide, self-mutilation. Children who have suffered from violence will also manifest an anxiety of talking in a group and will tend to put him or herself in the background. They may explode with aggression or start to feel offended quicker. The harm that they have suffered from other people can cause them to become mistrustful and suspicious, and eventually will lead them to start looking for company that would accept them as they are, such as a subculture or a sect. Obviously, single behaviors don't mean that the child is a victim of violence. Yet the very occurrence of them shall raise parents' and teachers' awareness. The more often it takes place, the bigger the probability that there is something wrong going on. The victims of bullying are trying to defend themselves from the role imposed on them very often. They are trying to suggest that their status is higher than in reality, boasting about their belongings and achievements, both real and made up. However, they don't realize that this kind of behavior results in the increase of aggression of the group. Some of them start acting as class clowns, willing to hide their anguish, which is a result of bad treatment by peers, and manage to get at least partly accepted. It's a vicious strategy, as the teacher may not see the problems of such children. It even happens at times that the children are incorrectly recognized as group leaders, for instance. The children are sometimes trying to compensate their worst position in a group by intense learning and becoming crammers. This makes them feel better and have some advantage over the other students. Playing this role doesn't protect them from being laughed at. However, it helps to raise the interest of teachers and parents. Small educational achievements help to prove that they are not worthless. Nevertheless, weak relations with peers damage the fragile self-esteem of the harassed person very often, and the role of crammer implemented just deepens the aggression. More sensitive students just draw into themselves. They hardly ever speak. They want to be invisible, just to leave them alone. Unfortunately, this kind of behavior triggers aggression as well, and the child is considered to be even more eccentric. Then what should a child that is a victim of bullying actually do? What knowledge can you provide him or her with before he or she gets even more hurt? Being aware of all the potential threats of bullying, you may agree on an action plan together with the child. In every situation when the child feels at risk, he or she should know that he or she can talk to you or a trusted teacher about it. The sooner the adults will react, the less dramatic effects of violent behavior will be. It's worth to know who of his or her peers the child considers as friendly and reliable. These may be his biggest allies in aggression conditions, apart from the adults. If the child becomes a victim of bullying and wants to take revenge, don't let him or her do it. The aggression won't stop. Just the opposite. It will get even more intense. What is significant for the caretakers, the child doesn't want to show that he or she is a victim very often, as he or she doesn't want to look weak. The child is ashamed of his fear and may even think at times that this whole situation is just his or her fault. If his or her self-esteem is low, he or she may even think that he or she deserves to be treated like that. He or she may even be afraid that asking an adult person for help will make him or her rejected by the group forever. To make matters worse, the child who decides to seek for help doesn't know how to talk about the aggression problem very often. He or she is afraid that none of the peers believes him or her, and the adults just don't understand. If the child had been rejected when trying to make contact, this kind of attitude may be deeply settled. That's why you need to talk with your child about his or her problems on every possible occasion. We have already managed to consider the factors that characterize the victim. What features and circumstances increase the risk of becoming the target of aggression? You have already become familiar with the warning signs which may help you to recognize that the child is being hurt at an early stage. It's high time to move on to the aggressors, their methods, and motivation. Is it worth it to pay any attention to them at all? Surely it is. For the aggressor's parents, this topic is very often as hard as for the victim's parents, if only because of the social stigmatization. Nobody wants to hear, "What kind of parent are you that you have raised such a monster," in a shop or on the street. Yet, are the culprits of peer violence monsters? What distinguishes them? What makes them aggressive? It often seems to us that these are only strong individuals that can undertake bullying or cyberbullying. We imagine them as expressive, stereotypical school rogues. However, that is not a rule. Thinking of the peer aggressors as solely strong and cold-blooded troublemakers can be extremely misleading and have a negative impact. Both boys and girls commit aggression. The head of the class, the team captain, or a shy, introverted boy, they can all apply bullying. Both a student that has very good marks and one that doesn't manage well at school. Peer violence culprits may be very different, and despite the fact that we would like to categorize them easily to feel in control that way, it's practically impossible. Although it's very hard, let's forget about the victim suffering for a while, and let's think about the problems of the offenders. It's important to have a look at the problem from their perspective to prevent the disease which bullying surely is, and not only treat its effects. It very often is the case that both the aggressors and their parents need help. All of them are socially condemned, pointed fingers at, being complained about. Yet very often the only thing that the parents of school rogues can say is, "We were trying very hard to raise our child the best we possibly could. We don't have much time. We both work. We love our child very much, and we really don't know how it was possible and at which moment we made a mistake." Revenge should not be our target. Looking for solutions which will ensure happiness and safety for our children should be. That doesn't exempt the offenders from bearing the consequences, but it should never be regarded as the only motive, is that would make the problem much worse to solve. Bullying and cyberbullying are very often means of dealing with problems for a child, such as frustration, anger, sadness, jealousy, but most of all, the fear of losing position and appreciation within a group of peers. It is very common for both the offender as well as the victim to have low self-esteem. However, only the victim manifests these feelings to make everybody see that he or she feels bad in his or her skin. At the same time, the aggressors disguise their complexes by unjustified self-exaltation and being contemptuous towards others. The more I disdain and humiliate somebody, the bigger the difference between us will be, and the better I will look in the eyes of my peers. Although this reasoning seems to be cruel and irrational, yet in the world of children and teenagers, and sometimes even adults, it seems to serve its purpose. The cost that you need to pay is seemingly low. Instead of building your own self-esteem on the basis of real achievements and relations, the culprit may reach his or her goals by teasing other people. Is there not a single person in your environment, at work or among friends, that you would say he or she behaves that way? The only difference is that the adults that are being attacked usually have many more chances of defending themselves than children do. What is the relation between the aggressors and the victims then? The research shows that boys undertake bullying towards both boys and girls. It is often the case that older students bully younger ones. Rarely does it happen within the same age group. Younger children harassing older ones doesn't happen very often. It only takes place when the child has the support of older friends and siblings. Whereas girls rather exercise bullying or cyberbullying towards female peers within their own age group. Where does this difference come from? Activities performed together with peers are extremely significant for boys, and bullying or cyberbullying may be a perfect group binder. You will probably remember that one of the main features that predisposes somebody to be a victim was the distinctiveness in a broad sense. Boys pay much more attention to the elements that distinguish somebody from the rest of the group, treating him or her as a threat to the group's cohesion. On the other hand, girls consider violent behavior to be a form of competition. They treat friends' harassment as a way of strengthening their position in a group. According to research, the features that distinguish most of the culprits of peer violence are strength and domination, both physical strength as well as the advantage of the group that the aggressor belongs to. Other factors, even positive ones such as erudition, developed vocabulary, or even material status, may result in somebody's domination. Self-confidence and a high opinion of him or herself, which may only be ostentatious, hiding the complexes and low self-esteem at the same time. His or her own conviction to be strong and powerful, very often in total contrast to reality. Easiness in subjugating other people, or even being despotic. Impulsiveness, not thinking about the consequences. Lack of ability to deal with frustration, anger, and annoyance. Aggressive role models within the home or cultural environment, especially when violent and offensive behaviors are treated as an acceptable norm or even something praiseworthy by the family or the neighborhood. The cult of power and managing everything at any cost that is so common nowadays foster low empathy levels. Weakness and everything that is connected to that are stigmatized, and taking interest in others starts to be associated with unnecessary affection. Where does the belief that boys undertake aggressive behavior more often come from? Violent behavior in boys is very often expressed more directly than that of girls. It manifests with physical strength or name-calling. Girls that become aggressors are usually much more sophisticated in their actions. Their behavior is very often indirect and hard to detect. You already know which children may become the aggressors more easily than others. Can you guess what the reasons are for that? As you have probably figured out, many are based on the upbringing that a child gets at home. These would be at the top. Negative parental attitude, especially from those that are responsible for the child's upbringing. A punishing, despotic, and verbally aggressive attitude which replaces real contact with the child and honest conversation. Quite often, these parents don't know their children very well, don't know what their passions, expectations, and fears are. Instead, they have their own visions and expect the child to conform. Tolerating aggressive behavior of the child which occurs away from home. Parenting methods that are based on often using force, aggression, and/or humiliation, corporal punishment, tantrums, etc. Features of a child's character that the parents didn't take care of in the upbringing process, such as impulsiveness or bad temper. Do you remember that when it comes to bullying victims, we can distinguish two basic types? The situation is no different in the case of the culprits. The first type is the socially extroverted one, which is a child who feels well in a group, likes dominating and subjugating other people. He or she also seeks popularity. It equals the stereotypical image of a school rogue. The second type is an outsider who may be considered to be a weirdo, keeping him or herself out of sight, even showing symptoms of depression. These children have low self-esteem, are always in the background, and may easily be influenced by others. You have probably noticed that this description matches the students that become the victims as well. The only difference is that the aggressors can be characterized with high level of aggression, impulsiveness, and empathy disorders. No matter what type of personality a child has, students who exercise violence have very often experienced it themselves, oftentimes within their own family home. That doesn't mean just physical aggression, but insults or other forms of humiliation as well. These kinds of people are very often fascinated with violence and its tools, as they have felt the influence of them greatly. They enjoy observing other people suffering, treating the victims as an object, and the feelings of satisfaction that come with their advantage. Violence is a mode of action that they think of as being effective and providing an advantage over others, because that's often what they have observed. A very special group of young people involved in harassing are bully victims, which are people that experience aggressive behavior from peers and, at the same time, undertake violent actions towards other people. It usually takes place in different environments. For instance, a child is bullied in the yard by some older friends and uses violence him or herself at school at the same time. This group of young people experience some serious problems which are not only limited to relationships with other peers, but also in relationships with parents and teachers as well. This situation concerns 4 to 6% of children and youth, so it's quite common. Young people who belong to this group are significantly different from the bullying culprits who don't experience victimization, meaning they are not victims at the same time. They are bad-tempered, exercising both proactive and reactive aggression, and have problems with their role models. They frequently suffer from somatic ailments such as headaches and constant tiredness, and they have higher depression indicators comparing to students who are not engaged in bullying. We have talked about the parents' guilt extensively in this lesson. However, the street or other environments in which the aggressor functions may also be the source of some negative experiences. If the offender notices right at the beginning that being aggressive only makes him or her more popular and isn't punished in any way, his or her behavior may escalate. That's why what we have already mentioned is so important: the mindfulness of caretakers and ceasing aggressive behavior at the earliest possible stage. In what circumstances should we pay attention to a child's behavior? If your child often gets involved in fights and quarrels. If your child has some friends that bully others. If you notice an increasing level of aggression in your child. If your child frequently gets punished at school, is sent for disciplinary measures. If you notice him or her having money or things and you don't know when or how he or she got them. If your child has a tendency to blame others for his or her own problems. If he or she doesn't take responsibility for his or her behavior. If your child is extensively interested in competing, he or she cares about being liked and popular at all costs. Let's go back to our friend Adam's story. You surely remember that Adam's main aggressor was Peter, a senior peer and a team captain. Although he was quite an average student, he was popular, sporty, active, and trendy. His schoolmates respected his opinions, executed his commands, and were seeking his approval. That's what it looked like at first glance. Would you believe that Peter was seriously afraid about his position in the group? Peter didn't think of himself as a valuable person. He was convinced that his peers only respected him because he could show off, he could confront anybody, and he is a good sportsman. He didn't think anybody really likes him. He treated compliments with distrust and carefully observed everybody that could threaten his position. He took everything he would describe as acts of insubordination very personally and was constantly worried that everyone would laugh at him behind his back. His father, the owner of a small company, often told him, "If you don't keep them on a short leash, you may expect shit instead of respect." That was the background of Peter's upbringing. Is that a picture of a self-confident, happy child? Surely not. Peter dominated and imposed conditions at school, yet it didn't guarantee him a similar position in the future. It's quite easy to imagine that, After a few years, he ended up in a group which consisted of many stronger and better off people. Following his beliefs, I am not worth much. Position within a group is the only thing that matters. I need to prove that I am worth respect. He has been making a lot of effort to gain the approval of those in his surroundings. He drank the most, was the most aggressive, and experimented with drugs. You can probably imagine the ending of this story. However, that was not the only scenario life could have written. Peter could have started university as well, continuing what he was doing at school and allowing his attitude and beliefs to become even stronger. He could have started a company and run it according to similar principles as his father, destroying anybody who objected to him. Sometime later, his own son could be born. What do you think? What are the chances that he would follow Peter's path? We really do hope that we have helped you to understand why the topic of the aggressor is so important when talking about bullying and cyberbullying. When offering our help to the victims, let's not forget about the culprits. One of the most significant features of bullying and cyberbullying is its group character. That's why, along with the aggressors and the victims, we will also pay attention to the third party involved, the bystanders. As much as 85% of bullying acts take place in the presence of other group members. In the case of cyberbullying, it is practically 100%, and the number of observers can reach into the thousands. Bystanders may perform different roles with varied types of activities in each of them. Christina Samovali, one of the most recognized researchers on the bullying phenomenon, suggests categorizing the observers as assistants, boosters, outsiders, or defenders. The assistants are bystanders who don't initiate the assault themselves, but when somebody starts one, they eagerly join in and help the main aggressor. The boosters are witnesses who don't join the culprit, yet by behaving in a certain way, for example by mocking the victim, they strengthen him or her positively by showing approval for what he or she is doing. The outsiders are involved in the incident, however, they don't help the aggressor. They neither boost him or her, nor do they defend the victim. They don't do anything, they are simply passive. They only observe the development of the situation, not really demonstrating their own involvement. The defenders are people who are trying to help the harassed person in every possible way. The fact that most children find bullying or cyberbullying negative is quite worrying, as the analysis of their behavior shows that most of them adopt boosting or neutral roles anyway. Meanwhile, the bystander's function is extremely important. As the research shows, most of the bullying cases end when the witnesses stand up for the victims. It's quite obvious that those who are involved in bullying and cyberbullying, and those who we should take an interest in, are the victims and aggressors. Nevertheless, are they enough? After all, in cases of bullying and especially cyberbullying, a single offender is not a problem, and the behavior of other children that are familiar with the acts of aggression is never neutral. Staying passive is also information for the culprit, a tactic consent. After all, it's the sole presence of passive bystanders that strengthens the culprits of peer violence. Prevention or intervention measures connected with bullying and cyberbullying always mean working with every single person that knows about aggression. So not only the culprits and victims, but also the bystanders as well. Why? It's quite simple. Their reaction may stop the harassment process quickly and effectively. How should you work with a child to make him or her react properly when witnessing a violent situation? Perhaps one of your first reactions was the willingness to convince him or her not to get involved in the whole incident. It's much easier and safer. It's not a good attitude, though, because the aggressor, when expanding the circle of his or her victims, may eventually choose your child as a target. Imagine that your child was a witness of a bullying incident. After a whole day at school, he or she decided to tell you about it. He or she says that he or she felt really sorry for the friend, but didn't do anything because he or she was afraid that he or she would become the next target. Didn't being a passive observer of such behavior have any influence on your child? Will his or her lack of reaction make him or her feel more helpless and less in control? And what's more, will it make him or her be more distrustful towards other people? Won't it make him or her feel that if he or she gets assaulted, the other students won't react as well? In this kind of situation, it is very common for the child who is a bystander to feel angry and sad. It makes him or her feel helpless, and he or she has a feeling that there is no good solution to this problem. If the victim is a close friend of your child, it additionally makes him or her feel disloyal and guilty. The situation of being a bystander of violent behavior can be compared to passive smoking. The effects are not visible straight away, yet they have a postponed negative impact on the child's development. Then what can a child do in the situation of witnessing aggressive behavior? It's important for you to make him or her aware that he or she is not the only person that is willing to react. 4 out of 5 students think and feel the same when witnessing bullying behavior. It may be assumed then that if a significant group decided to speak out, they would be able to resist most cases of violent incidents. We should remember that in such situations, the advantage in the number of people involved changes the structure of hierarchy, and the aggressors deprived of the audience that boosts their behavior lose all the satisfaction from the acts of violence. It's us, the adults, that need to bear the burden of preparing children to react actively in the situation of witnessing aggression, mainly by a conversation and making them aware how important bystanders are and how much change they can make. What specific arguments should you use? What advice to give? And what kind of behavior patterns to instill? First and foremost, it is necessary to inform an adult, parents and/or teachers, about the situation as quickly as possible. It's particularly important for the reason that a lot of violent behavior happens when there is not an adult nearby. It's important to encourage the child to speak up that he or she doesn't accept bullying and cyberbullying. That will make other peers more courageous to react, and your child will be able to exercise his or her own self-esteem. The attitude of, "I'll just keep a low profile," or "I'll just applaud violence, it may make me more popular," reinforces anxiety and low self-esteem, loosening the feelings of social responsibility and depriving him or her of the possibility of taking control of the situation. Ensuring your support for anti-bullying behavior undertaken by your child is not to be overvalued. Don't just be one of the people who are also afraid of the aggressors. You are an adult, and the culprit is just a child who faces some problems him or herself. React. Encourage your child to convince his or her friends to join him or her and oppose bullying or cyberbullying together. If a group doesn't approve of such activities, violence may be stopped before the offender even decides to act. It's worth to make the bullying victim hear that he or she doesn't deserve to be treated this way. Your child, who is a witness of violent behavior, should know that he or she can make a huge change if only he or she shows that he or she is not indifferent. Aggressive behavior within a group of peers is dynamic. If your child doesn't react today, he or she may become the victim the very next day. Encourage him or her to show the harassed person interest. Let him or her invite the harmed person to the cinema, talk during a school break, or just spend some time together. Thanks to such actions, you will develop empathy in your child, and you will be able to help him or her shape his or her hierarchy of values. It's important for your child, to the biggest possible extent, to participate in his or her peers' environment actively. By doing so, he or she will have an influence on shaping the surroundings in which all the people will be co-responsible for their own as well as the others' safety, and they will know what to do to prevent bullying and cyberbullying. If your child will be brought up in such an environment, it will only reinforce his or her self-esteem, and the lack of social fear will have an influence on their creativity and imaginative thinking. The role that bystanders play is huge. It's they who have a great chance of making a change to violent behavior among children and teenagers. Rarely do the observers serve a completely neutral role. Some of them trigger aggressive behavior. The others make fun of the victim and comment on the situation, while still others join the culprits over time. There are also some witnesses who passively observe what is happening, not being aware that the lack of reaction also encourages the aggressor to carry on his operations and strengthens his sense of power by providing him with the audience. If the observer's role is so important, then why do so few people react? What usually comes to mind first is the thought about shifting the responsibility towards the others and claiming that it's just none of my business. It mainly takes place in a situation when the witness experiences fear connected with the violent situation himself, or when he or she doesn't feel any bond with the victim, and additionally doesn't want to focus the aggressor's interest on him or her. It happens at times that when the bystanders don't like the victim of aggression, the culprit of bullying becomes a sort of exponent of the group's violence. What consequences may passive bystanders need to bear? Contrary to what one might think, not so small. They may often have a sense of guilt and shame that they don't react, and are afraid of turning the offender's aggression on them, so they don't talk about the problem with anybody to avoid being confronted with their own emotions. The bystanders who remain passive only strengthen their sense of helplessness and powerlessness, cultivating the attitude of, I cannot do anything about it. By that, they become susceptible to future acts of violence of which they may become victims themselves. The children who directly boost aggressive behavior experience similar emotions. It seems to us adults that they must have an evil nature. The aggressor starts to harass, the group just stands by, laughing and recording the incident with their smartphones. Remember, though, that a group of peers has its own dynamic, and if the leader imposes a sort of behavior, it automatically becomes cool and worth to follow. Thereby, the group starts to enhance its behaviors, thinking, if the leader kicked, then I shall kick as well. I'll become a more important part of the group. I'll be even cooler. In the context of large groups, crowd psychology is even mentioned. Using scientific terminology, the phenomenon of diffusion of responsibility, conformity, and eventually de-individualization play a significant role here. Let's return to Adam. We should recall the situation which took place already after the first suicide attempt while the boy was leaving school. It was then when a group of seniors poked him. Somebody kicked his backpack, and somebody else shouted, "When are you getting back underground?" Somebody started to record the incident on his smartphone at once, which made the other students more encouraged to show how cool they are. What they thought was expected in this situation was to bully Adam. The boy started to pull at his clothes, lightly at first. Somebody shouted, "Give me this sucker." the turmoil started to attract the attention of other students. Nobody protested the way Adam was being treated as the conformity started. The students, predicting what the group expected from them, started to behave this way, encouraging the aggressors even more. Those who didn't accept the situation either went away or just stood reactionless, thinking, "Why should I expose myself in the name of principles?" Or blurring their responsibility with the attitude of, "The others will react." The behavior that was expected towards the victim was being imposed by the leader. The whole school learned that this boy should be bullied. So the bullying started to be desired. It even started to be something to be proud of. Every single person that wanted to keep his or her position in the group could join the aggressors by pushing, kicking, and spitting on Adam. Less courageous ones only yelled and called him names. 80% of students that declared to be opposed to such practices were just standing aside and watching. The group of aggressors started to grow in strength. Every next actor of this incident wanted to show that he is better and more imaginative than the previous person. De-individualization took place. None of these children would act the same in face-to-face situations with the victim, yet as a group they proved themselves to be violently creative in inflicting suffering. The aggression was becoming more and more forceful, whereas the victim had little chance to defend himself. It ceased to be of any importance that the girl whistling at Adam is Anna, who would like to be a ballet dancer, feeding homeless cats every day. And the boy that kicked him is Tom, a member of a school team, usually held up as a model for younger students. The reaction of the group was the only thing that counted, and the situation that started with just a small poke evolved uncontrollably into an extreme form of aggression. There was one person missing in the cheering crowd. The person who would react early enough by standing against the group of aggressors that would shout, "Stop! How dare you!" and took Adam out of that violent circle. That would probably save the boy who wanted to hang himself that very same afternoon. You should remember that opposing a group that is growing in strength is extremely hard. A child may not be brave enough to do so. Don't expect it from him or her if he or she is not ready for that and considers his or her position in a group as too weak or is just simply afraid for his or her own safety. Yet make sure that he or she is not afraid to tell adults about the whole situation. May they find the strength to intervene in defense of the harassed person. Unfortunately, there are many notions of aggression both in the real world and the virtual world, and the case study of Adam mentioned in the previous lessons clearly shows to what extent these behaviors can be destructive. After an endless series of direct, indirect, and eventually virtual violent acts, the boy became a withdrawn, depressed teenager for whom, according to himself, there was no place within this awful society. Psychiatry precisely describes the health effects that bullying victims may suffer from, because if traumatic events can have serious implications for adults, then what can their impact be on the fragile psyche of children? Although, from the perspective of an entire life, the period of schooling is relatively short and is also reduced by holiday breaks and vacations, it is an extremely significant time as children are in the process of emotional, intellectual, and social development at this stage. The influence of a peer group during that period is highly important, sometimes even more relevant than the relations with adults. If a child feels isolated from a group and doesn't have a sense of belonging, his or her development in many different spheres will be slower. Some emotional problems like nightmares or bedwetting may even occur. Using modern technologies like the internet for the purposes of bullying leads to a situation where the victim is constantly afraid that some new materials mocking him or her have been published. Neither holidays nor a family home can be considered as a safe haven anymore. Trust in interpersonal relations and a sense of security, very important elements in shaping social identity, are being distracted. You can easily imagine what happens with a child that experiences such emotions. He or she starts to get worse marks at school, doesn't like going there, starts to feel lonely and misunderstood, and eventually withdraws from any social and family contacts. The sense of shame and humiliation makes it impossible for him or her to undertake new relations and continue with old ones. Yet the most dramatic consequences, just like in the case of Adam, are suicidal attempts or successful bullycide. Psychological consequences of bullying and cyberbullying. Cyberbullying is an exceptionally destructive form of violence as it disrupts the sense of security in places where a child would normally be able to find respite. When it comes to the victims of aggression, due to their individual predispositions, the effects and their intensity may differ. However, the situation of repeated, long-lasting mental and physical harm may cause PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is responsible for personality development disorders. Difficulty in sleeping, irritation or tantrums, concentration disorders, hypervigilance, and exaggerated anxiety reactions may take place. The state of extended violence forces the child to be constantly watchful and insecure. It is not an exaggeration to say that it's a state quite similar to the one we recognize in soldiers coming back from war. If you think that the case is a bit exaggerated, read what a 14-year-old girl from New Jersey who suffered from cyberbullying said. "Internet harassment is worse. It's torture and making harm. It is said that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words would never hurt me. It's simply a lie, and I don't believe it. Sticks and stones may only cause nasty wounds or an injury which heals over time. Offending words harm deeply, and sometimes healing these kinds of wounds takes an eternity." In this kind of situation, children mention self-disgust, sense of shame, valuelessness, and loneliness, suffering from recurring thoughts and images of being mocked and humiliated. Cyberbullying is even more dangerous as the stressor, physical cause of stress, for example, a doctored photo, may be found on the internet many years after it had been published. Protracted violence results in the changes of sleeping and eating habits, as well as losing interest in the things which had been quite enjoyable before. It happens at times that the victims themselves start to manifest aggressive behavior and become the culprits. For instance, a high-profile case of the shooting in Columbine where the gunman had earlier suffered from bullying. Health consequences of bullying and cyberbullying. The list of health disorders is quite long. As a result of extended stress, developing children may suffer from migraines, neurotic and psychosomatic disorders, or gastric diseases. Gastrointestinal illnesses such as diarrhea, ulceration, hypertonia, and immunosuppression are quite common. Other health problems such as pericardial effusion, breathing difficulties, allergic reactions, increased vulnerability to diabetes, and suppression of menstruation in girls may have dramatic repercussions. Social consequences of bullying and cyberbullying. From a young person's social life perspective, bullying has some extremely destructive effects, beginning with an aversion to going to school and ending with establishing relationship disorders, and what is obvious in that situation, an unwillingness to trust others. All the social effects of bullying are long-lasting, very often take place throughout the whole adult life of a victim. There are some educational problems which have some measurable consequences. The research conducted in Great Britain shows that the teenagers who have suffered from peer violence are twice as prone to fail to finish school, which means they may have some difficulties with finding a job. This in turn causes young men who have suffered from the complete circle of peer violence to be 3 times more vulnerable to depression and 5 times more likely to commit crime. The effects of bullying on the culprits and the victims. What may the consequences of being the culprit of bullying and cyberbullying be? The most significant and long-lasting ones, affecting a young person's whole life, are difficulties in building and preserving valuable relationships, both as a teenager and an adult. If violent behaviors become consolidated, they may start to function as a main model of conduct in the later period of life as well, towards workmates, partners, and finally, your own children. Young aggressors start to abuse alcohol, drugs, and medications more often than others, and it starts as early as adolescence. Their behavior becomes more vicious. They get involved in fights, commit acts of vandalism, and very often end up members of criminal groups. They start their sexual activity, often based on treating the partner instrumentally rather than with a real bond, much earlier. It's always connected with undertaking risky sexual behaviors, frequent partner swap, accidental contacts, or unprotected sex. Bullying has a negative impact on the whole community of children involved in the phenomenon. The bystanders also suffer from enormous stress and tension connected with the sense of guilt very often. They are more likely to start smoking, drinking alcohol, or using illicit drugs. Because of the stress that they perceive, they may suffer from some mental disorders. Very often they stop considering school as a safe place, and because they are convinced that the adults cannot provide them support and help, these young people start to feel more and more fearful and insecure. You already know briefly what the consequences of violence for our friend Adam were. 2 suicide attempts, depression, and anxiety disorders. In the period prior to his hospitalization, Adam refused to leave his room, didn't eat much, talked to nobody. He had problems with falling asleep, suffered from painful diarrhea that was caused by constant stress. These were, however, only temporary symptoms. Apart from these, some attitudes were being consolidated, a distrust towards the world and people, and a conviction that there is no chance for justice, and that the only thing that matters in the world around him is brutal strength. During one of his therapy sessions, Adam said, "If they like you, if you have wealthy parents, if you are stronger and can beat anybody, then you can do everything. No one can stop you. How can anybody? Nobody will stand up for somebody that you bully, because then you'll beat him up too, and all of them will lose anyway. You can show anybody that he is actually nobody." Answering the question, how would he like to achieve anything, he said, "I don't know. Maybe I just need to be stronger, making them like me more." We don't know what the future consequences for Adam will be. Will he be able to avert such strong negative beliefs on the world and people in a therapy process? Let's hope yes, as we haven't mentioned one important thing here. Adam was real. He had a different name, but all the harassment that you've heard on your previous lessons and all their implications were real. We have already discussed the consequences that his culprit, Peter, had to manage. What about the bystanders? After Adam's second suicide attempt, as a result of which he went to the hospital, there were numerous interviews conducted with his schoolmates. The interviewers found out that 9 out of 10 children were against bullying in any form. Why did it take place then? And why was it so intense? The children weren't able to answer this question very often, and when asked if they feel safe at school, almost all of them answered no, or rather not. For the question, do you think you might become a victim of peer violence or cyber violence? They usually answered, yes, that's possible. And for the question, what would you do in such a situation? The answers were normally, I would make up a story for my parents to move me to another school, or I would try to wait until they got bored. What is terrifying for the question, would you report such a case to an adult, a parent, or a teacher? The students usually said no. And when asked to elaborate on this answer, they added, "What for? They won't make any change." See what happened here then? Although most of the children were against this type of behavior, and almost everybody was afraid that he or she may suffer from violence, almost nobody wanted to seek help or any other solution of this situation. One basic problem that parents need to manage is the awareness of the threat, such as bullying itself. You surely remember that Adam's parents only noticed that there was something wrong going on with their son when he tried to take his own life for the first time. Unfortunately, that happens very often. That is why we need to remain alert to some signs which may be symptoms of harassment. What are direct signals that the child has become a victim of bullying? You have the right to feel worried if your child has noticeable injuries whose origin is hard to explain, provides improbable explanations concerning even the smallest injuries. For example, "I hit the locker," "I bumped into the door," and these kind of situations reoccur. Comes back home with his belongings damaged, a torn jacket or backpack strap. Often loses or damages electronic devices, phones, tablets, headphones. Mentions that he or she doesn't have anyone close at school. Stop showing interest in school, including extracurricular classes which they had enjoyed previously. Is afraid of going to school or directly expresses fear of his or her friends. Has started to get worse grades at school. Isolates him or herself or explodes in the middle of a conversation about school or people from his or her surroundings who should be close to him or her. Often claims to be ill and wants to stay at home. Often has head, back, or stomach aches. Occasionally suffers from diarrhea. Starts to exhibit eating disorders, either too small or too big appetite. Refuses to change his clothes in the presence of his peers. Doesn't want to take part in PE classes, providing various reasons for that. Starts to wet his or her bed at night. Has some signs of self-harm, cuts on wrists or thighs, or manifests such behavior, beating him or herself, pulling out his or her hair, biting or scratching that causes wounds. Shows some symptoms of emotional disorders, has intensive mood swings. Neglects his or her appearance, claiming all of a sudden that it doesn't matter. Is withdrawn, depressive, behaves childishly in relations with peers. Loses the initiative, doesn't build relations with other people willingly. Demonstrates tendencies to use alcohol or drugs. While typical cyberbullying symptoms are not using a telephone, tablet, or laptop, anxiety, anger, or sadness during or after using web pages or phone apps, for example, throwing away a phone on a sofa. Avoiding discussing what he or she does online and what is going on there. Naturally, in cases of cyberbullying, typical symptoms characteristic for ordinary bullying may also occur. How should we intervene then so as not to harm the child even more? A conversation should be the first step. It should not be limited to a casual, "Is everything all right?" It must be a deep and honest discussion during which you will surely encounter some difficulties. A child who suffers from violence experiences emotions such as shame and the feeling of humiliation and helplessness in a very intense way. What is more, while having a conversation like this, you will also experience a mixture of very similar feelings. You will be afraid of causing the child to experience the harsh moments again, as well as the fight against the embarrassment and humiliation in the face of a parent. It's really important for you not to pretend that there are no such emotions in you. Be honest with your child. Don't try to hide your feelings. Children are usually able to recognize their parents' behavior very well. So if you want your child to open up and be frank, you need to behave in exactly the same way. How to conduct such a conversation to make it the least uncomfortable for the speaker. It's really important that the place of the talk is quiet and safe. If your child is a young learner, he or she may have problems with naming some things. That's why it's worth to prepare some crayons, paper, or a favorite stuffed toy. If it's a teenager, those extras won't be necessary, yet some paper and a pen may be useful. Sit so that you are equal to your child, preferably in a place that he or she points, either on a sofa or the floor if he or she wishes to. Don't start the conversation if you don't have enough time for it. Those moments are to be reserved for your child only. Switch off your phone, the TV, and the computer too. It's worth to think about the aim of the conversation and plan its course before starting it. However, you need to remember that this plan is aimed at making the conversation easier and not really becoming an obligatory checklist. The most important thing is to follow your child during the conversation. He or she should feel that you are interested in what he or she is saying and not only in what you want to achieve. The child should be sure at all times that what you really care about is to provide him or her with your support and make him or her feel that you are around. Simple awareness of your sincere backup may help the child to open up. It's worth to start the conversation from neutral yet important to the child topics, for instance, concerning his or her interests, or things he or she had done well recently, for example at school or in sport. The child sees more than it seems to you and is very sensitive to the lack of attention. If he or she notices that you don't care much about the conversation about their interests and you want to move on to another topic, you will lose your chance to make good contact. Only when you feel that the child is relaxed and opens up to you, you may move along to asking him or her questions connected with the aim of the meeting. Start with some open questions. For example, could you possibly tell me about this incident? I would like to understand better what happened to you. Try not to ask questions that may suggest the answer, like, was it in the yard or at home? Or, did Jake hit you? Were you attacked by him? As they may scare the child. Paraphrasing, which is saying with your own words what the other person said. For example, if I caught that correctly, you said that, is very useful in improving the contact with him or her and developing a feeling that he or she is listened to and understood. You should also try to name what the other person might feel. I can see that you are sad. I can tell that you are nervous when you are talking about. No matter what the situation will be, try to use simple language, appropriate for the age of the child. Talking about violence that he or she had experienced may be emotionally severe for the child. During such conversation, he or she may cry, show fear, pain, be ashamed, or get angry. It's very important for you not to deny his or her feelings and not to trivialize them, even if you are afraid or tense. Don't run away from these emotions. You must accompany your child in this hard experience. It's also extremely important for the child to hear during the conversation that he or she is not guilty of what had happened, and he or she is not to be blamed that he or she didn't report the incident straight away. You must directly tell him or her that you are very happy that he or she has placed so much trust in you. If the child wants to know what you are planning to do after the talk, where are you going to look for help, you should tell him or her that. While making such conversation, try to avoid some behaviors. Don't try to comfort your child too much. If he or she is in a hard situation which hasn't really changed for a long time, then saying, "Everything will be all right," or "Don't worry," will only be a sign of disregard. Say, "I'm listening to you and I'm close," but don't try to comfort him or her. Don't cry during the conversation. Don't get angry. You need to be the support for your child, so avoid situations where your child needs to comfort you or calm you down. Hug your child only when he or she clearly wants it. Don't ask questions beginning with why. If your child is not able to answer and explain them, you will only cause shame and fear. Questions beginning with why very often attribute blame and responsibility. For instance, why did you go there? Why didn't you just run away? Why didn't you tell anybody? Do not question what your child is saying, even when what you hear seems to be improbable. Don't try to judge on your own if your child is telling the truth about having suffered from violence, as each of these situations needs to be checked and explained. If the child denies the violence, calmly explain to him or her on what basis you suspect that may be different. Don't expect that you will get the answer during the first conversation. Sometimes the child just needs time to reveal the truth. Don't give any advice. Saying, "In your place," or "You should have done that," will only make your child feel stupid, or give him or her an impression that he or she disappointed you. If your child has suffered from violence, he or she feels ashamed right now. Don't make it worse. Avoid criticizing and judging. No matter what, don't say anything similar to, "Only a clumsy person would have allowed something like that." Don't correct your child, even when he or she confuses some facts. If he or she talks about some problems with Peter on a lesson, and a moment later he or she talks about the same incident that had happened in front of the school, let it be. Let him or her describe everything with his or her own words. Don't pick holes in what he or she says. Don't ask about the details of the incident straight at the beginning of the conversation, as it may traumatize the victim of violence. Let him or her say whatever he or she wants to. Avoid making snap promises. Remember that not keeping them may make it harder for you to win your child's trust in the future. By no means, do not promise that you will keep that conversation secret. If you promise that, you will not be able to undertake any intervention. Otherwise, you will risk losing your child's trust. If he or she pushes further, saying, for instance, "Just don't tell anybody, all right?" Explain then that you cannot promise him or her that, but you will think what steps to take and you will discuss them with him or her. Who should make the conversations? If it is possible, the conversation should be made by the calmer and more self-controlled parent. If you know that in the context of this situation, the father may not control his anger, let the mother do it. It's worth to consider for which of the parents does the child want to look better. For example, if a daughter wants her mom to have a good opinion of her, and it's hard for her to admit to any failures, she may not willingly talk about being a victim of violence. It's better to make the first such conversation face-to-face. Obviously, the parent may use the form "we," indicating that both the parents see the problem and they both provide support. However, children usually open up faster when there is a balance of the parties involved. Also, the simplest one, in the number. One conversation is not always enough. Sometimes you need a few of them, conducted in a similar way to make your child believe that the parent has good intentions, or simply for him or her to find enough strength to tell you about everything. It's extremely important then for you not to lose patience. What to do when your fears find confirmation. If you have learned during a conversation that your child has suffered from violence, you should undertake certain actions. After the talk, write down all the violent situations that he or she told you about. Do it afterwards, not in the middle of the conversation. Figure out if there is a special law or policy of conduct in cases of bullying incidents in your region. Find out if the school has an anti-bullying program or any methods of dealing with such situations. Arrange a meeting with your child's form tutor and the school's psychologist. Declare your will to cooperate and discuss what should be done in such a situation together. Take notes on all the arrangements made with the form tutor and the school psychologist, as well as all the actions taken by them. Contact the form tutor or the school psychologist as often as you find it necessary, asking what has been done in your child's case, especially if he or she claims that violence still takes place. If the form tutor hasn't taken any effective steps, arrange a meeting with the headmaster to present him or her the situation. Try to find out if there are other parents that have the same problem, and then try to contact them and act collaboratively with the school. Look for some specialists available in your area: pedagogues, psychologists, non-governmental organizations, foundations, which may consult and which may support you and the workers of the school, helping your child at the same time. Report the case to the police if your child was beaten or robbed. If the school still hasn't taken any effective steps to cease the violence, request the supervisory authorities to investigate your child's case and assess actions taken by the school in order to solve the problem of violence. Look for a psychologist at school or a counseling center nearby which may help your child to deal with being a victim of violence. Remember not to confront the culprit on your own. That will only make your child's situation worse, as it will not only make him or her feel weak, but will also make him or her become the aim of even more violent attacks at school and outside. You must only act by talking with your child, the victim of the bullying, and through the school. It is the teachers who should react and talk to the culprit. As you are a part of this conflict, while having a potential conversation with the aggressor, you could get angry easily. And you should remember that this is also a child who has some problems. However, it is worth to expect from the school to organize a meeting on which you will meet the form tutor, the headmaster, and the culprit's parents. Don't try to arrange a meeting with the aggressor's parents on your own. Try to control your emotions and accept that you may need a mediator in advance. At this stage, it is better to keep the bullying victim at the back a little and act in his or her name, keeping him or her up to date with all the actions and arrangements. If your child insists on not doing anything, talk to him or her. Ask why he or she thinks that. You will probably learn that he or she is simply afraid of making his or her situation worse. Talk to him or her every day then, making sure that you will do absolutely everything to stop the violence. However, if the child remains defiant and you notice that the symptoms of physical violence or the mental condition of your child starts to deteriorate, eventually even leading to some suicidal thoughts, do not hesitate to intervene, no matter what he or she says. Remember to tell him or her clearly, though, that there's nothing else you can really do to save his or her life and health. Reject the thoughts of changing school straight away. Don't teach your child that in difficult situations it's best to run away, because as a victim of violence, he or she may adopt some habits, and that may lead to a similar situation in the new school. The intervention should not be an escape, yet the way to manage a child who has suffered from harassment. Changing school is only worth considering when the institution doesn't undertake any effective measures. The violence lasts despite taking some steps, and there is no agreement between the sides of the conflict. Remember to follow your child. Don't offer him or her to stop going to school for some time, as this is another way of escaping from the problem which may be hard to turn back from. Instead of this, try to help him or her actively in solving the problem. If the child strongly resists and refuses to go to school, define the period you are talking about, except for example, 1 week of absence, after which the child must, unarguably, go back to school. Further staying at home will only make him or her feel inferior, weak, and helpless. Is it possible that your child uses violence towards other people? The most common and natural answer to that question is indignation and disbelief. However, it must be directly said, each case of bullying has both victims and culprits as well. It's not easy to notice signs of aggression in your own child. People who use violence at school very often implement it at home as well, though this is not a rule. Aggression may accumulate and its signals may be very delicate. Abusive comments about others, scorning somebody while talking, cynicism, as well as the lack of empathy in treating and talking about other people. It's worth to listen and take a look at our child's behavior at home, because there's a chance we may notice behavior such as using violence towards siblings. So, if you are afraid that your child may implement violence towards other people, observe his or her relationships with their siblings, you, and his or her friends when they come to visit. Children who use physical violence towards other students may themselves come back home with some bruises, scratches, and torn clothes. They may suddenly have more money than usual or bring things home that they cannot afford. Eventually, they may regard other students in a disrespectful and hostile way. Various kinds of difficult situations at home may have an influence on developing aggressive behavior in a child. The way he or she deals with solving problems is strictly connected with the way the problems and tensions are solved at home. Do you talk about difficult and sad issues, conflicts, losing things, or the death of loved ones? Or do you rather remain silent and go back to everyday life, hoping that the problem will solve itself and the child will forget or deal with it on his or her own? The answer to that question is insofar as important as one of the most basic ways of teaching the child to repress aggression is to set a good example yourself. If you want your child to be empathetic and capable of talking about difficult issues, you need to be like that yourself. It's important for a child to know what violence and cyber violence is and what consequences these phenomena may have. A child that has become the culprit of violence needs to be provided with a clear message. This kind of behavior is not to be tolerated by you as a caretaker, and you will take immediate actions in reaction to any signs of aggression. Reprimanding, objecting, or eventually applying proper educative measures. If single remarks are insufficient and the child keeps behaving aggressively towards his or her peers, you should take up some more explicit measures. Remember that the lack of reaction is a message that a child is allowed to take up risky behavior. The intervention shall be quick and decisive. Don't let your own sense of guilt or shame restrain your reaction. Don't be afraid about the consequences for the child as well. The lack of reaction or delaying it may cause all the effects, either mental or legal, to be more severe. When you react to a child's violent behavior, don't get angry. Try to stay calm and self-controlled. Don't escalate the aggression. Even raising your voice too much may provoke conflict and make the child stop listening to you. Speak slowly. Don't condemn the child as a person and instead point to specific behavior that you don't accept. It's very important for your behavior not to be an abreaction of anger on a child, yet to be motivated by concern. The issue is not to fight with the child, attack or humiliate and punish. In crisis situations, you will fight for keeping the respect of an adult, and a child will fight for keeping his or her position at home and among peers. Your intervention should be based on calm and consequent reaction, and not the attack. It should take the form of saying, "Stop. I don't agree. Stop doing that," without using violence, beating, and calling names. Quite often it's not easy, because as an observer, you will be more distanced from the whole incident, yet the emotions will be similar to those of its participants. What is crucial in such situations, especially when children are involved, is not intensifying aggressive behavior. A parent who finds out about problems should decisively stop the aggression in the first place. If that is cyber violence, he or she should demand the removal of the photos, videos, or comments which are abusive, or maybe even limit access to the equipment temporarily. He or she should speak simply and assertively, treating the child, the culprit, as somebody who can take responsibility for his or her own actions. He or she needs to remember all the time, though, to show respect to the child, criticizing his or her behavior and not him or her as a person. How to talk with a child, the culprit of violence. Begin with describing behavior which you have heard of and you simply don't accept. It's a signal that you precisely recognize and understand improper behavior and give the child a chance to change it at the same time. Become familiar with some examples of proper argumentation. "Thomas, I don't agree for you to bother Mark. Calling names, pushing, and laughing at somebody is harassment and aggression. I do understand that you are angry, but I don't like what you did. I will not accept such behavior." "Martha, I feel bad that you publish abusive comments about Jenny on the internet. That kind of behavior is bullying. I expect you to remove these comments right away. You cannot build your position in a group on somebody's harm. I don't approve it." Remember to refer to the rules that you use at home that you comply with. We don't use violence. I would like to remind you that we have agreed that this is unacceptable behavior. Say how you feel when your son or daughter behaves improperly. List all the things you don't accept, that worry you, and make you sad. It makes me upset that you happen to be aggressive. I feel so sorry that you don't respect our agreements. I was shocked and angry when I found out that you beat up your friend. Another very important step is to express your expectations towards the child. Remember to do it calmly, yet decisively, without aggression. Offer the culprit to rethink his or her behavior, him or herself, addressing him or her with the words, "I expect you to think about your behavior towards your friend, and I would like you to compensate for it to Paul. Think about it, and I want to know what your answer is by dinner." You have to remember, at the same time, that you must determine what, when, where, and how it will take place. If the child doesn't know what to do, help him or her with planning. Don't forget to tell your child what consequences of aggressive behavior he or she shall bear. The punishment that you will impose should be adequate and possible to undertake. For example, no TV and films on the internet for a month. I will inform school about the whole incident, and if your behavior doesn't change, you will be forced to change the class. Remember to act consequently. If you mention any form of penalty, apply it so that your child knows that your words are of great importance. Emphasize that it was his or her behavior that led to such results. Under no circumstances should you withdraw at this stage, even if your child apologizes, suddenly changed his or her behavior, or promised to behave better. It is only your unshaken consequence that may influence the change in his or her behavior. In situations of conflicts that are linked to aggression, it's not worth to push in order to make the child apologize. That does not mean much if the apology is connected with anger, helplessness, or regret. The apology makes sense if it is linked with the feelings of empathy, sympathy, care, and sadness connected with the incident. If you play your cards right, the child will feel after some time that he or she wants to apologize or make it up to the victim for what had happened. The trap that parents most often fall into when they are victims of mutual aggression is looking for the guilty one, the ringleader. That is not the correct attitude, as it doesn't have much meaning for neutralizing the occurrence of aggression. There's no place for looking for who is more or less to blame. Instead of this, we should enforce that the culprits must take responsibility for their actions. The question, "Why did you do that?" will usually remain unanswered, or it will be superficial. If you want to know the reasons behind your child's behavior, you should rather ask, "What happened that you reacted so violently in this situation?" You should often emphasize your willingness to talk about the problem. Talk about your feelings connected with it. Sometimes I just feel helpless when I hear how you call each other names, when you push or spit on somebody. I'm angry that my child can bully others this way. Call a spade a spade. Aggression, violence, harassing, bullying, and name-calling. Show the results of violence for all the parties involved, the culprits, the victims, the witnesses, and first of all, encourage your child to think how to fix the results of aggression and not let this kind of situation happen again in the future. What further actions to take towards a child who is a culprit of aggression? It's important that your intervention does not finish with a single conversation, but starts a complete dialogue aimed at ceasing the use of violence by the child. During your discussions, let the culprit speak on his or her own. Ask open questions, and when he or she stops talking, help him or her with some questions like, "Can you tell me something more about it? Describe it better. Explain the situation." These conversations should be finished with signing a contract with your child that includes an obligation not to use certain aggressive behavior. To make this contract effective, it should be formulated in a very precise way and include information on the consequences of not applying it. A firm reaction when one of the points of the contract is not respected is extremely significant. The penalties themselves should concern single acts of aggression. Every unwanted behavior should result in an immediate talk and concrete punishment. Such talks should be conducted systematically until the negative behavior of the child completely evaporates. Observe his or her behavior at that time. Ask the form tutor about his or her learning progress and relations with peers. Monitor his or her internet activity, informing the child about it. Although these actions are not the most pleasurable, they are aimed at minimalizing the possibilities of manipulation by the young person and give him or her a signal that you care about him or her, even if he or she rebels against it. While working with the child, the culprit of violence, the most important thing for the parent is to help to replace previous aggressive behavior with a positive one. Without this, aggression and violence won't disappear. This kind of work needs time, engagement, cooperation with a psychologist and teachers. By collaborating with them, you will be able to appreciate your child, compliment him or her for positive behavior, or organize him or her educational classes which will help him or her learn how to fulfill his or her own needs in a positive way, developing his or her natural abilities. You have found yourself in a situation which seems to be favorable. The bullying process has been stopped, the violence has ceased, and help was provided. Is that all? Any further behavior towards the child depends on him or herself alone. Help that is enforced will affect the re-victimization, which is experiencing suffering that the child had already gone through again, and will not help with the proper development process. Sometimes it may well be that a child will manage the situation better than you yourself, yet it is a good idea for you to be attentive. If you notice any changes in your child's behavior that does not stop after the violence has ended, it is worth to take some steps. Having experienced violence, most parents have a tendency to treat their child in an excessively fearful manner. If the child develops a sense of mistrust, it will result in withdrawing from the relation and some emotional problems. You should remember then to show him or her that despite the fact that he or she has experienced violence from particular people, does not mean that all people are malicious. The way the child him or herself reacts to the situation of becoming a victim is influenced by his or her early emotional development and the attachment patterns which were shaped in the very first years of his or her life to a great extent. A safe bond with a parent, which is characterized by the freedom to explore the world and good contact with his environment on one side, and on the other side the possibility to ask for support, results in having good opinion of the child about him or herself and being able to deal with a number of difficult situations. This kind of child has high self-esteem, perceives the future and other people's intentions positively, manages excessive tension, and reacts to their own emotions adequately. It is worth to teach your child, a victim of aggression, that he or she is not the one to be blamed for the situation, and nobody, by any means deserves to be treated this way. It may also be a sort of relief for him or her to know that this kind of incident happens to many children, and the violence itself can be stopped. Try to teach your child how to deal with hard situations. Discuss how to manage different types of violence, suggesting solutions like ignore what the perpetrators say. Pretend that you do not care. Do not show that you are sad or angry, as your anxiety only makes them more satisfied and encourages them to attack you again and again. Try to show that you are self-confident. Walk upright. Keep your back straight, head up. Remember that the aggressors are looking for students who look as if they cannot defend themselves. Respond in a confident and strong voice. Try to look them in the eye. The victims of bullying often talk quietly and shyly, and that can only encourage further teasing. Walk away, not worrying about what they think about you and what they will talk about behind your back. Remember, the longer you stay and listen to them, the more fun the bullies will have. Answer the aggressors' questions shortly and decisively, not accepting their behavior or showing that you just don't care. Don't talk to me that way. Say whatever you want, I just don't care. If you feel confident with that, use your sense of humor, as it is often the best weapon against aggression. If you are able to laugh in such a situation, the culprits will get the signal that you just don't care. Use the element of surprise by doing something that will confuse the aggressors. For instance, pretend that you cannot hear. What are you saying? Louder. But what am I doing? I can't hear anything. Hello? If you have a close friend that you can share your concerns with, talk to him or her, as that will probably make you feel better. Sometimes even spending time during your break is enough, as bullies attack single students more often. Practice some scenarios with your child, and he or she will be much better prepared to react when facing an unpleasant situation. Preventing the violence and intervention are not the only factors of eliminating aggression. The development of healthy relationships is equally important. It is connected with some face-to-face or internet relationships between people that are full of respect. Teachers, parents, and other adults should be role models in this regard, as positive bonds between children depend on their relations with the adults. Children who are able to have some proper relationships are less likely to use violence towards others. Instead of that, they will support the harassed students and achieve educational goals that they set for themselves. What further steps should be taken at home? Most children do not talk about their problems with their peers, mostly because they are ashamed, worried of not being understood, not willing to worry their parents, or the lack of belief that they will get any help. Do not wait for your child to come to you. Take the initiative. Rather listen than talk. Ask, but do not give any advice. Do not trivialize and ridicule the problems. Try to use the events that you have read about in newspapers or the internet to talk about violence and the way it can be managed. Pay attention to whether your child is willingly visited by his or her friends after these hard moments, if he or she has some friends, and if he or she builds relationships. Some alarming situations are also a reason to have a conversation in such cases. And what if you want to talk but the child does not? What if he or she diminishes and trivializes your concerns? Do not get dismissed by answers that are too short. You do not need to get all the answers at once. Yet try to talk to the child more often, not only bringing up hard topics, but also discussing his or her interests or everyday life. It happens that from your child's accounts you learn more about his or her peers than you do about your child. It is an element that you can take advantage of. Talk to other parents. Agree to exchange some information when any of the children are in trouble. That kind of relation with other parents has other advantages. If your child comes into conflict with the other parent's child, it will be easier for you to find a solution together. If you don't want your child to get involved in any violence-based dealings, and you want him or her to be able to deal with these kinds of incidents, it is necessary to shape and strengthen his or her self-esteem. A child that lacks it finds it more difficult to oppose being treated badly. What are the ways of reinforcing and working on the child's self-esteem? Spend time together. When a child feels that the parents enjoy being with him or her, his or her self-esteem grows. Praise your child for particular behavior and achievements. Instead of saying, "You are polite," say, "You greeted your friend nicely. See how happy she was?" Take care of your child's peer relations, offering him or her to join some sport clubs, art classes, etc., depending on his or her interests. Let your child have his or her own point of view and respect it during conversations. Do not be overprotective. Doing everything for the child and replacing him or her makes him or her feel that he or she is weak and cannot manage the thing him or herself. To make your child handle some difficult situations, you need to be the first person to believe that he or she can do it. Do not be aggressive in the interaction with the other parent. Children learn through observing, and if there is aggression and violence at home, physical or verbal, the child will have some difficulties with dealing with the same problem outside the house as well. Do not argue in the child's presence. You may not agree with each other, but do not use any insults. Teach your child that everybody deserves to be respected. Teach your child to defend against unwanted behavior, setting boundaries, saying no, even to adults. Make sure that your daughter knows what to do if anybody, an adult or a peer, pinches her bum. Check if your son knows how to react if a boy a foot taller than him pushes him passing by. Explain what to do when somebody accosts him or her in the street. In such a case, it is always best to ask another person for help. Ring the doorbell of the closest house or call using fast dial. It is worth to practice all sorts of situations that may worry us and our children, and you can even make up some of them. All these elements are important for the child's development and his or her feeling that he or she is not left alone. How to make school a safe environment for the child. How to enable him or her to be successful and not being afraid of his or her safety at the same time. The most important thing for the school is to have an intervention plan in cases of peer violence. Without setting clear rules, it is hard to organize any actions against violence or draw consequences. Find out if your child's school has a system in place and how it works. If there isn't one, you should push the school, in cooperation with other parents, to have one implemented. Some provisions in the statute of the school are an absolute minimum of an anti-bullying system. They should include detailed consequences of such behavior for the perpetrators, as well as the procedures which will be implemented after revealing any dangerous incidents. All this information should be available to all the students, and they should be familiar with it. They should know what to do in such cases, how to react, and who they can ask for help. The parents should also know school's policy on peer violence to make them speak with one voice together with the teachers and form tutors. It is worth to know that there are some countries where these kinds of cases are managed by the government. Finland, in its Basic Education Act, determined that every single student has a right to learn in a safe school, and education authorities are obliged to make every effort not to let the students experience any form of violence within the school environment. In Sweden, the Discrimination Act dated 2009, as well as the Education Act dated 2010, forbid any forms of discrimination or bullying at school, and the school itself is obliged to research and report all the cases of peer violence. What rules of conduct may significantly lower the number of violence and bullying cases? First of all, reacting in every single case. The first step should be admonishing the students who do not obey the school rules. If repeating it several times does not work, then some individual conversations with the person that uses bullying, his or her victim, and the witnesses should be conducted. It is crucial to organize a whole series of meetings until the aggressive behavior fully stops. The adults, meaning the teachers, form tutors, and parents that are engaged in the situation, should react to bullying immediately, strictly, and consequently. They should stay as calm as possible at the same time, avoid aggression, and adjust the reaction to a specific violent behavior. Eventually, the school should become a place where children may learn how to replace aggression with other forms of expressing dissatisfaction. They should be taught to respect the other person's rights, as well as tolerance and respect for their gender, sexual orientation, religion, culture, and/or values. All this in a peaceful and aggression-free problem-solving atmosphere. In the second place, a friendly environment. A friendly environment is one that makes people feel safe in a well-managed school, with some established rules and the space for the constant development of policies concerning children's behavior. School authorities are responsible for establishing a clear message concerning violence, bullying, and cyberbullying. All students and teachers should know that these are unacceptable. Research shows that the more often the school's personnel or parents intervene in cases of peer violence, the less such behavior takes place. In the third place, qualified personnel. That is the school staff, especially the teachers and form tutors that are particularly responsible for reacting to some dangerous incidents fast. For that reason, they should be well prepared for that. There is a risk that a poorly prepared teacher will only make the situation worse, or will unfairly punish the person who is, in fact, the victim. In the fourth place, educational programs. One of the most important aspects of the functioning of a school is implementing educational programs which are aimed at raising awareness of peer violence, programs directed to the teachers, children, and the parents. Bullying, and especially cyberbullying, often goes unnoticed or is ignored by adults who consider it to be a natural form of learning discipline and a normal element of the adolescent period. It is significant to develop the social awareness to peer aggression and its consequences in children and teenagers. In the fifth place, easy reporting of bullying cases. To be able to help the victims of bullying quickly, it is important to provide some simple and confidential ways of reporting the cases of violence so as not to expose the child to a risk of revenge. A good example of such means are anonymous phone lines, online chat rooms managed by some pedagogues, or some fill-in forms available at web pages. It is worth to take care of a complex system of data collecting in such cases being implemented, which may be helpful in cases of future prevention. How can teachers manage aggression and peer violence? The teacher's attitude is very important in cases of conflict situations. A teacher who wants to cope with the aggression of his protégés must convey the standards of conduct in a clear way. The lack of acceptance for the aggression and violence, treating students fairly, and a system of punishments and rewards for positive behavior. Although that is not easy, he or she should also be an example by being patient and yet extremely consequent at the same time. One of the ways of coping with aggression may be by making an agreement with the students, which will set the code of conduct and form the students aimed at making life within a class entity easier. This agreement should be accordingly obeyed by all the students and teachers and may include a system of punishments and rewards. The punishments should concern aggressive or dangerous behavior, whereas the rewards should be granted for a fair play attitude, peer help, and generally speaking, having a positive contribution to shaping the class culture. The cyberbullying problem seems to be a little different, as not only the bullies but also the witnesses play a significant role here. The problem may grow beyond the awareness and knowledge of the teachers. A badly organized school system may contribute to that. The lack of consequences towards the aggressors, turning a blind eye, or considering cyberbullying as less harmful than direct aggression. Although averting cyberbullying is an element of prevention and educational programs in many schools, its implementation by the teachers, especially in cases of cooperation with the parents, leaves a lot to be desired. It is really important not to treat cyberbullying in terms of youth indiscretions, and not to ignore it only because it mostly takes place outside of the school. Fortunately, it is a problem that is noticed and appreciated more and more often, and the debate on preventing violence with the use of the newest technologies has been conducted for many years now. These are the media which very often become allies in the fight against cyber violence. They try to raise the awareness of both parents and students to the harm that may be caused by using the internet or a phone carelessly. How can parents prevent cyberbullying? To make prevention work, it is also the parents that need to get their job done. Talks between parents and the child concerning internet safety should be accompanied with setting the rules of using the computer and the internet. As some research shows, this takes place relatively rarely. 16% of parents declare that they did not set any rules of this kind with the child. 54% of parents only set rules concerning the amount of time spent on the web, not taking account of the other issues. Only 3 in 10 parents settle the issues of reacting to violence by other internet users and the rules concerning meeting people met on the web. Apart from setting the rules of using the computer and the internet, some parents take control of what their children are doing on the web. The most common means of such control is putting the computer in a place that enables the parents to observe the child using it. Some parents become familiar with some web pages which the child is planning to visit, or checks the history of the pages opened. Unfortunately, only 1 in 4 parents claim to be using filtering software, whereas the presence of a parent by a child that uses the web, which is particularly important in cases of the youngest internet users, hardly ever takes place. It also appears that the ideas the parents have are very often completely contrary to the behavior and experiences of children on the internet. According to the research, 1 in 10 parents note that their child has suffered from offensive actions from a stranger, whereas as many as 43% of the children researched declare to have been offered a meeting, and 1 in 5 young internet users met a person from the internet in real life. There are also some large discrepancies concerning the contact with some dangerous contents by the children. Only 1 in 5 parents think that his or her child has come across some pornographic materials or aggressive content, whereas in reality, 71% of children in the case of pornography and 51% of children in the case of materials containing violence suffers from such situations. The parents estimate that only about 1% of children suffer from cyber violence, which makes the problem go unnoticed. Meanwhile, children state that 47% of them experience some vulgar insults, 21% ridiculing or humiliating, 16% blackmailing, and 14% publishing some discrediting contents. This discrepancy indicates bad communication between the parents and the children. Parents should be the first to find out about all the dangerous situations that their children need to face, because, as we have already said many times in the previous modules of this course, it is only fast and responsible reactions that enables the child to avoid being harmed. We concentrate our everyday thinking of violence, bullying, and cyberbullying on the here and now. What to do in order to not let my child ever experience such situations. What to do to stop violence and help my child in the case where the aggression has already taken place. Hardly anybody wonders what influence this kind of experience may have on the adult life. What the effect of having experienced peer violence may have in the future depends on many factors, beginning with the sensitivity of the nervous system, temperament, upbringing, and the way the personality of a young person is shaped. It also depends on how old the child was when he or she suffered from the harm, if he or she had to deal with any traumatic experiences previously, and finally on the kind of support and help the child received. Some natural differences between people are the reason why some people adapt to the conditions and work the trauma out, whereas others have to face many post-violence symptoms called by some researchers as adult post-bullying syndrome, APBS, which is a disorder very similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, mentioned before. It is difficult to recognize this disorder, yet it is necessary to get proper help. It's very important to diagnose the person correctly so as to avoid secondary victimization, namely the situation in which the victim of bullying undergoes his or her former experiences in a much more intense way than if he or she had been left alone. Attaching too much importance to some events that happened many years ago may result in the symptoms being intensified and become an even more serious disorder. What is trauma after all? What does it mean that somebody has experienced a traumatic incident? When can you say that the experience was traumatic? Understanding the trauma is beyond the scope of the brain itself. Traumatic events not only deprive people of the sense of meaning, safety, and control, but they also make them confront helplessness and fear. Although we associate trauma with events like war, extreme violence, the death of close people, or tragic catastrophes most often, it may also be caused by some events that take place next to us every day. Many scientists think that trauma is diagnosed not as an objective dramatic incident, but as a terrifying life experience, confronting the person with the feeling of fear, helplessness, and fright subjectively. Even normal harm that may seem to be insignificant to some bystanders may become traumatic, as these are our own emotions which are responsible for sensing the trauma subjectively. Mood disorders have an influence on how big the suffering of the victim is, which is revealed in the form of depression, insomnia, fear, or alienation. That is, our mood and our emotions determine how we manage our life and how we perceive the world to a great extent. In 1980, the syndrome of post-traumatic mental disorders was finally treated as a medical condition. It was then when the American Psychiatric Association included a position called post-traumatic stress disorder in the official diagnostic textbook. People who had suffered from long-lasting harm experience this medical condition, which undermines and destroys the personality as it has a form of progressive stress. People suffering from post-traumatic stress are afraid that the situation which caused it may happen again. They are constantly tense, anxious, complain about some persistent headaches, gastrointestinal disorders, constant backaches or pelvic pain, sleep disorders, and many other somatic discomforts. They may have some symptoms of depression, insomnia, nightmares, and severe anxiety disorders. Shortly after including PTSD in the catalog of diseases, the problem of trauma in the context of family violence that affects children started to be discussed. It was proven then that children who are harmed, neglected, mistreated, or sexually abused have a negative view of themselves during their childhood as well as later in adult life. They cannot defend themselves against the assaults, aggression, abuse, and the stress and negative experiences that they had been going through unconsciously direct them to inflict physical and mental pain themselves and even seeking a situation which will repeat the trauma on purpose. Long-lasting stress may result in permanent changes to the whole central nervous system, as well as the development of mental disorders. The intensity of emotions experienced in a traumatic situation has an influence on what will be remembered by the victim. He or she will remember ordinary experiences differently than some traumatic events. The situations remembered will be incomplete, fragmentary, incoherent, and may be connected with some particular senses, smells, sounds, which may cause the memories return. All these experiences are responsible for the emotional attitude of a specific person. The psyche does not perceive the passage of time between the traumatic incident and the present moment, yet the brain senses as if it were happening right now. Especially in the case of children, it is not the incident itself that determines trauma, but what the victim thinks of it. Both bullying and cyberbullying are forms of physical and mental trauma which has an enormous influence on the subjective experience perception of a child. It affects the way children perceive the world and themselves, their beliefs, and their behavior. The moment the trauma appears will have a great influence on the magnitude of changes within the psychological and neurological development of the child. Events that are particularly dangerous and that take place again and again over a long period of time may cause the emergence of aggression towards the child, him or herself, and other people. Concentration and attention disorders, some somatic problems, difficulties in shaping identity, and forming relations with others. Having been born, children do not have any reasons to be mistrustful. They are dependent on adults, so they must trust others. Only when there is aggression or neglect at home, children learn the lack of trust, and having experienced peer violence at school only strengthens their attitude of mistrust towards others and shapes their low self-esteem. These emotions affect their relations, such as close friendships, which should be based on sharing observations and experiences. This kind of behavior mounts especially fast in cases of bullying, when a child cannot count on close friends who do not want to take either the victim's or the aggressor's side, becoming passive observers. During this, loyalty is put to the test in a few seconds from a particular incident only. Smartphones, text messages, social networking sites make the observers and the participants take one side very quickly, and the victim is excluded from a peer group right away. And although there are some children who are exceptionally resistant to such situations, they feel bad, move on from the person that harmed them, and afterwards make friends with somebody else, most children become mistrustful towards people who are seemingly close to them after having experienced such things. These kinds of people will feel helpless in situations when they need to establish some closer relations in their adult life. On the one hand, like every single person, they want to have friends. On the other, however, they are not able to get closer to the person for fear of being rejected or attacked. People who have suffered from peer violence even mention experiencing hate towards other people, having had the feeling of being constantly judged. The research conducted on bullying suggests that it is these experiences that make further ability to establish relationships seriously disordered. Long-lasting peer aggression also influences the adolescence period when young people start to experience some closer relationships with other people their age. The perspective of dating somebody, which is a natural element of adolescence, happens to be dissuasive and discouraging for the victims of bullying and cyberbullying. The teenagers resign from these highly exciting experiences, having the feeling of being worse than the others and being permanently exhibited to some critical judgment. In Europe, as early as 2004, there was research conducted on people who had suffered from bullying as children. These people experienced the feeling of loneliness and made fewer friends and close relationships in adult life than people who had not been victims of peer violence. Their low self-esteem caused them to feel that they do not deserve healthy and satisfying relationships. Those people were not able to believe that anybody would want to share their life with them, They were also convinced, even after getting involved in a relationship with somebody, that sooner or later they will be rejected. Let us mention in the end that experiencing rejection in the situation of bullying and exclusion very often results in the feeling of anger, which may be directed both towards others as well as towards themselves. Children who had experienced violence and therefore the feeling of losing control over their lives may feel that they have nothing to lose. Young people who feel responsible for becoming a victim of bullying experience a greater sense of guilt and shame in their adult lives. Whereas those who think that it is only the wrongdoer who is responsible for violence are troubled by the sense of harm and hostility in relation with other people. Remember then that situations in which somebody suffers from long-lasting violence and exclusion can affect the whole life of a person. The emotions which are awakened as a result of rejection may be concealed for many years, only to explode severely in the least expected moment. Adam's story, the epilogue. In the end, we would like to tell you about what happened with Adam, the 17-year-old boy whose whole world collapsed because of a seemingly unimportant incident which ultimately triggered some serious drama. Having found Adam half dead in the bathroom, his parents took him to a psychiatric hospital despite his objections. He is currently staying there after another suicide attempt. He is not able to find his place outside the hospital. He isolated himself from all relationships, and even the thought of coming back to school raises his anxiety. In the hospital where he is currently staying, they diagnose some symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorders in him. The boy refused to talk about school, generally avoiding discussing the topics connected with his life. The feeling of tension and anxiety dominated. He checked his mail and phone nervously, for fear of receiving another unpleasant message. He felt useless and worthless. He had the feeling that he would never achieve anything in his life. Nothing positive may ever happen to him. What is more, he does not deserve anything positive. Adam was angry at the people who were the culprits of violence, feeling that he is so stupid himself that it only caused them to be more aggressive. He felt lonely. He lacked friends. Yet he admitted that he himself abandoned the ones he had. He did it partially for fear that they may join the aggressors, and partially because of a feeling that he was a bad companion, and sooner or later, they would reject him anyway. Adam stopped being interested in anything. The hobby that he had so far no longer made sense to him. Sometimes he exploded with anger for no reason and burst into tears straight afterwards, not really understanding what was going on within him. At that time, one would have the feeling when having contact with Adam that the boy was tense and alert all the time, as if he was expecting another attack. When his parents or the nurses entered his room in the hospital, he jumped up from his bed. He stopped learning, saying that he cannot focus on reading and studying, and he keeps thinking about some stressful situations that he had experienced. By considering over and over again his reactions in some particular situations, he had some difficulties with falling asleep, and he woke up feeling anxious in the middle of the night. Luckily, Adam's parents, although late, eventually paid attention to their son's problems. If that had taken place earlier, if his parents and teachers had noticed the symptoms and how hard the situation was for Adam before, and that he had had depressive moods, their reaction might have changed a lot for Adam, and his trauma may not have deepened.